For those that are here initially, welcome. What we're going to be talking about today is Twinkie wants to become a little better at coaching, so we're going to be talking about mostly game theory and things like that. So, about done deafening, and we'll get started. Hello.
Hello, sir.
You can see my screen, I'm assuming?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Let me swap over the stream real quick because I have transition thingy. Yes, there we go.
Transition thing you say.
Slowly getting more functional with the streaming stuff.
Out of curiosity, at this point in time, is there anyone else asking for coaching advice?
No.
Huh. All right. Because I was about to say, like, it'd be kind of interesting to know.
Right now, it's
There
just for
was.
play.
Pog. All right, sick.
All right. So, we're going to touch on a couple things today. Right?
Yes.
Now, keep a couple things in mind. First off, this is the discussion above all else, right? If you don't understand something, please absolutely contest me on the point. That's fine. We'll get going over it to the point where we can fully understand it. Second, there will be some times where I will just straight up overrule you. This is a very rare occurrence, and I hate doing it. So it'll happen as little as possible. Normally, when this process occurs where I'm working with someone, it's either I've shown them the math and they're just saying 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. And I'm like, well, you're just wrong. I'm sorry. Or, excuse me. Or it'll be a moment of, the best example I can give of this would be we're diving someone. It's like 15 minutes into the game. I can guaranteed see a way where 100% this works out. I can do basic math to show proof of concept. But then the other person says it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, we could go into practice tool and prove this proof of concept. I have done this before. But we don't have time. So those would be realistically kind of like the two variations, in which case I overrule someone. But I try to do that as little as possible because it fucking sucks on both ends. Let's be realistic about that.
Mm-hmm.
No one likes hearing you're just straight wrong, let's move on. And I hate doing it. All right. So, before we get into the full coaching about like how to actually coach people better, first we have to understand how the game works. So on screen right now is what we're going to be actively going over in order of how valuable it is. And we're going to start from top to bottom. As we go through these concepts, I'm going to be typing more and more onto it. And at the end of this, I'm going to send you this list.
All right.
So you will have all the Spark Notes. And this will be the Spark Notes variation. This will not be full paragraphs and everything like that. It will just be overarching concepts. All right. So first thing to talk about, actually, before we continue on that, does all of that make sense?
Absolutely. I definitely don't really see myself having much to argue about. Primarily because, like, most of the time when I'm coming to you to ask you questions about stuff, you more often than not give me answers that are 99% of the time something that I would either have agreed with in the first place or something that I just didn't know entirely. That being said, I also wanted to let you know that you don't need to worry about taking too many notes as we're going, because I am handwriting all my notes too. So,
Awesome. Okay.
yeah.
That's fine. I'm still going to do it for stream, so I will just keep it at the full Spark Notes variation then.
Sounds
I'll
good
keep
to
it
me.
a little shorter than that, because then realistically, people watching back at this VOD, they'll be able to hear us talking too, comparatively.
Gotcha.
All right. So, off this, we're going to start with game theory. All right. And realistically, between all different games, game theory is relatively consistent, where you can transition things from one game to another relatively easily. It's just with genres, normally it's much more fluid comparatively. So for instance, you look at a MOBA comparatively to a MOBA, you're going to have a lot of similar concepts go between them. So, you've played Smite, correct?
Sir,
Okay.
I've played Smite and Dota too.
So, when you're looking at Smite comparative to League, one of the things I love, when I'm looking at both those comparatively, is how the jungle works. Because realistically, it's virtually the same game. It is 3 lanes. You have a duo lane, you have your mid lane, you have your solo lane, you have your jungler. Everybody has their own isolated role. And for the most part as well, those isolated roles are very, very similar, where you're looking at Hunter, so AD carry, plus support. Awesome. Then you're looking at mid lane. Generally, you're looking at something with higher wave clear, something that's more mage-oriented or cast-oriented. For the jungle, you're looking for something that is something that is much, much more flexible comparatively. And then solo lane, you're looking for the beefcake. for all intents and purposes. You can run carries there, but you're looking mostly beefcake, right? So, when you transition between both of those games, there's something that is vastly different between them, and that comes into play with the jungle. Where one jungler, League's variation, is very farm heavy. We look around and we see, hey, we want to be able to farm these camps and do these things, and we might wait 20 seconds for a gank to be able to function because we have no other camps to be able to take at this current point in time. Smite jumps around like crazy, where the jungler's pathing is literally, I take speed buff, I take one thing from Wraiths, and then I go immediately mid to go kill people. I am killing people within the first 20 seconds of the game. And they just keep doing this pattern of sitting mid consistently and moving around the map with their mid laner and just murking everyone and taking everything. So I want you to think about this for a second. Why is there that stark difference between the two games? Just for that concept in particular.
I'm having quite a bit of brain lag at the moment. Could you describe what we were trying to
Sure, absolutely.
basically differentiate?
Yeah. So in League, jungling is much more slow and much more methodical, where we're looking to take camps, we're looking to move around the map still. We're still looking to play around our laners, the similar concept as in Smite. But Smite, on the opposite hand, is we're taking speed buff, we're taking one more Wraith camp or Harpy camp, it's Harpies, there we go, and then immediately running mid lane to go kill people, and then push the mid wave, and then go kill more people, and it's just a constant fight fest, comparatively.
Mm-hmm.
So why is there that differential between those two games? Everybody's the same role, but they have two vastly different playstyles. What is causing that differential?
Isn't the differential because there isn't really like a last hitting in that game? It's
That's
not nearly
one of
as
two reasons.
important.
Absolutely. Because if anyone who's around the minion when it dies actively gets gold. So sharing experience and sharing gold is much more valuable in Smite comparatively, including with camps as well. So there's very little reason to ever solo camps. What's the second reason? What do you think the second reason is?
That is something that I'm not too particularly certain of. I don't actually have any ideas to rattle off either.
Okay, that's perfectly fine. So, in Smite, camps die near instantaneously. Even from the start of the game. You can look at a Harpy camp, any of the basic XP camps, and snap of your fingers, they're just gone. Starting from level 2. Gone. Poof. So with that, there's a lot more downtime in Smite, because you walk to a camp, it's immediately cleared. Walk to a camp, it's immediately cleared. Walk to a camp, it's immediately cleared from the start of the game. Eventually, in League, you get to that same point. But League also has a slightly bigger map, and that causes more issues as the game progresses for people trying to move around the map. Again, comparatively to Smite. Right? So, with the two differentiating playstyles, everybody's playing the same role. The map is very, very similar conceptually. It's still, again, the 3 lanes. People are playing the same characters in the same roles in each of the games. But because of two minor differences, the game is played infinitely differently, and people hate Smite for it a lot of the time. Because the game is over by 10 minutes. And all it takes is very little tweaks to be able to cause that. Right? Excuse me. So, similar thing. When you're looking at game theory for all of the different games, game theory is very fluid and volatile. And because of this, you can always find things that are the same in games and then learn how to start abusing those very minor things. So for instance, when you look at a game now where, for instance, we'll look at MOBAs, and you're looking at something where the time to kill camps is incredibly tiny. All of a sudden, the pace of the game has incredibly increased. Massive differential. Let's even swap it up. Let's say Pokemon Unite. I'm assuming you've played some of that too, correct?
Yes.
You take Pokemon Unite. What happens if we reduce the time to kill camps by 50%?
That's going to speed up the game pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, laners don't even clear their first wave before the jungler's on top of them and 2 levels above them.
Yep.
So then, similar concept, right? Game theory then needs to be applied where all of a sudden, okay, everything needs to still be balanced in some fashion, so we reduce time to kill. We now need to reduce experience, right? And again, you can keep looking at those different concepts to be able to find whatever is broken and then be able to fix it accordingly, because now we understand how to fix it. So another great example of this is, how laners operate. Have you ever been explained pockets in lanes before?
Yes. So based on which side of the lane you're standing in, like if you're playing towards like top side river pocket in mid lane, that's going to be that side of the river. It's going to be
Right.
on the left. Whereas if you're playing towards bot side pocket, you're playing on the right side of the lane.
Correct. So here's the fun part. Why isn't that concept applied in Smite? Why can't we do
Isn't
the
it?
same thing?
Isn't it because the majority? I can't remember if it's either because the junglers have ways to just kind of skip the pocket because of their mobility, or if it's because of the pacing.
Here, I can give a better example. When you look at my screen, I'm going to draw one of the lanes. Let's just assume it's a straight line for all intents and purposes. Much easier to draw, right? Let's
Yep.
say the jungle is on this side. This is the edge of the world.
Yep.
So, even if we're saying junglers have very high mobility, they can get to the opposite pocket relatively quickly, right? We can establish in League, let's touch on just League for a second, that if you are playing on the pocket that is close to jungle side, you are essentially saying, I am looking to move around the map to be able to help my team or to be able to contest the opposing jungler. Beyond that, you're putting yourself at risk to go near the danger zone. So then realistically, right, if we're looking at Smite, the funny reason of why it's not applied is because players aren't good enough to do it. And they don't understand game theory. Because what other reason would there be to be able to play, to not play an opposite pocket when you have nothing else to do? There isn't one. You're just putting yourself at more harm's way if you have no reason to rotate. So I distinctly remember in early years of Smite, like the first 1 to 4 seasons of Smite, no one played pockets. No one played around their jungler. No one knew what teleport was for solo lanes. No one utilized it. No one still utilizes teleport in Smite, by the way. That concept still doesn't exist. No one cared for itemization and the math behind it except for one team, which was Zapman's team. Name began with Knee. Don't remember it. They had one analyst. That analyst was great. But no one cared about any of those concepts. And it took literally 4 years before even the most basic MOBA concepts began transitioning into Smite. Even just this pocket concept, if you go watch Pro Smite right now, does not exist. But why not? Why isn't it transitioning? Why aren't these basic things then moving over? Right? Let's even swap to another concept. Where let's look at shooting games. You play Valorant quite a bit. So off of Valorant, if you're with a team and you have comms and you're about to peek a corner, generally your response is going to be, hey, I'm going to peek this with X utility to make sure I'm safe. If you don't have utility to make sure you're safe, the next words that come out of your mouth are, someone peek with me, let's trade 1 for 1. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Can that concept be applied to MOBAs in some way?
I mean, I guess you could. I think that there's a lot more like utility pieces in a MOBA that can kind of make your trades even safer. So per se, like, hey, we're gonna go 1 for 1 here. You just set up your support to die, and you're guaranteeing that the gold is going in the right direction, provided, of course, it doesn't get stolen through like a burn ability, some kind of passive, or like ignite.
Mm-hmm. So even with that in a similar context, we also talked initially about, I'm going to use my utility to be able to check around corners to make sure this is safe. That concept applies to lead very easily. Every time a mid laner rotates, they're going to throw skill shots into bushes to make sure they're safe. They're going to place wards to make sure that they are safe if they have them active at the time, right? On top of that as well, what happens when a support goes to ward on their own into the opposing jungle? And they have no idea where the enemy is.
Typically going to get clapped if they don't have good vision, and they don't have a backup buddy to make sure they don't get clapped. Then more often than not, someone's going to see them entering the jungle and be like, hey, let's collapse on this guy. He's on our side of the map. And whichever lanes have prio are just going to come down and clap them.
Exactly, right? So with that, the way you prevent that is you say, hey, team, come with me. Let's make sure I'm safe. It's exactly the same concept, verbatim. There are a lot of things that apply. Excuse me. Let me type this out. Things apply to multiple... I forgot how to spell for a second. Things apply to multiple games very easily. This is also why there are times where I go to Valorant practices. I just watch the Valorant team play. Because there are things that I have the ability to take away from their play that I might be overlooking for League. And off of that, this is also why people who are generally at a high level for one game transition to other games very easily. It's because they have the ability to find these similar concepts and then work off of them. Right? And again, it's much easier to transition from one MOBA to another, right? So you go from League to Smite, and all of a sudden, if you're playing in pockets, you understand basic itemization, you understand basic rotations, and it's like, oh, hey, the pace is faster. Cool. Jungle plays around mid. Awesome. Now I understand that concept. I already have everything else. We've now put specifics to generalities. We're good to go. And all of a sudden, that learning curve becomes much, much, much less steep. And you can learn things a lot faster. And then from there, you can focus on the more minor aspects of the game. Does all of that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we're also going to talk about one other very, very important game theory, and this one applies to League in particular. Or MOBAs in particular, should I say. One of the funnest concepts in all of MOBAs are your job is to be able to kill your opponent while being as tanky as possible. To put that into perspective, as that is causing my epic pen to have a spaz attack, I'm just going to move this down here. So when I do this, it'll just pop up with that and it'll be fine. Just ignore that bottom part.
Cool.
Right. So let's assume someone has 100 life, just for simplicity's sake, right?
Yep.
And you have 80 life. Okay? With this 80 life, you have the capability to deal 400 damage. We're overkilling this person by 300. Right?
Yep.
So would you say this is a good or a bad build?
I mean, if you're at 80 life and you're dealing 400 damage and you're killing this person multiple times over, that seems like significant overkill. I mean, the big factors would be like how far ahead is this person? What do they have on their build? Because if they are full tank and for some reason they have 80 health and they're doing 400 damage, that's like but in this specific case, I'm not particularly sure if it would be a good build or not because I don't know how much damage the 100 health person is doing. Like in League terms, if this is a 800 health character dealing 4k damage, then odds are they have something in their kit that's helping them move around, and that would be the reason that they do that much that kind of damage. But like realistically speaking, you should be having some kind of health or armor, and you want to be able to match that 100 health as best as you can, and in lane specifically.
Ooh, not even in lane. You're on the correct concept, though, it's in general sense, right? Because a lot of the stuff you said can be completely ignored for this concept. Realistically, if you are dealing 4 times the target's maximum life and damage output, you're way overkilling. So your concept of what happens if they're building full tank and they're just dealing that much damage, that's just something that's very broken. So you're right. That would be absurd. So then if this were the case and this was like full resistance and this was all the life and this was another tank, then yeah, that would function. In all other circumstances, you wasted your gold. You wasted all of your gold. And especially if you're ahead, you've wasted all of your gold. So now here we get to the next concept, right? So let's keep the person at 100 life, right? Now all of a sudden, let's bump up our life to 300. And we do 200 damage. Now we're getting a little closer to what we're actively looking for. Let's swap it up one more time. So now the opponent still has 100 life, and now we have 400 life. And now we're dealing 100 damage. When we've hit this equilibrium of just barely being able to kill the opponent while being as tanky as possible, that is when we have found the correct build. Why is this build, the 400 life plus 100 damage, better than the 80 life with 400 damage?
I think it would be probably time to kill. Either that or because the 4 to 100 is you're barely overkill, so you have that guarantee in case there's any kind of healing or any sort of outside factors that would help them. And that 20, if it's single target damage, can carry over to your next target during whatever situation you've got or XYZ factor on that. But I would say that it's because mathematically speaking, you have the higher number, like in combination.
Okay. So that's, you're not exactly there. So the way I like to phrase this above all else is you want to be as tanky as possible with having the ability to still kill your opponent, right? So with 400 life and 100 damage, you still kill your opponent that has 100 value of life. That's a terrible 100. Let me undo that. Nice. There we go. This 400 life plus 100 damage still kills this 100 value target. This 80 life plus 400 damage still kills this 100 value target. You accomplish exactly the same thing. So what happens if this 80 life target gets jumped? What happens if you miss a skill shot? What happens if the opponents can get on top of you? You killed your target and then they jump on top of you. You're just dead, right? When we have the much tankier build that's still accomplishing exactly the same thing, you're still doing the same thing, but now you can't die. So since you brought up a second ago, whenever a person, like if the person's massively ahead and that's why they're doing that much damage, that still means the 80 health 400 damage is an incorrect build. Because when you're ahead, your damage output is naturally higher. You're correct in that concept. If your damage output is naturally higher, why do we need to build more damage to kill the target that's behind? We don't. So the best thing to do when you're ahead is to build tanky.
Yep.
To build resistances. Unless something is absolutely required in the core of your build. So kind of like Jinx, right? Let's say Jinx gets ahead. She's not going first IMGA. It's not happening. In current state, she now has the option to just rush Shield Bow, though. That's an option over like Kraken Slayer and things like that. Right? So then, similar concept, right? That concept right there transitions to every single MOBA. And fun fact, I didn't learn this concept from League. I learned this concept from Smite. Because in their tank meta, when tanks could walk around with 3,000 life taking -2 damage per auto attack, they could still kill anything in the game. So if a tank can walk around and kill a squishy, and the squishy has no chance whatsoever of killing a tank, why would you ever build damage output? And why would you ever play a damage character? Never served a purpose. And the first time I really noticed this was I was facing a Nuwa. She's a character where she summons soldiers, detonates them, and she has a Karth Assault. That's kind of all she does. She's a mage. And her build at that point in time was a tank item, a tank item, and a tank item. And she was still one-shotting people. If she built any damage output in her build whatsoever, it was completely wasted. All she did was build resistances and health. And she was still just able to kill people. So there was no reason to be able to do it. That was the moment I fully recognized that there is no reason to build more than what is required to be able to kill your opponent. I also just had this conversation with someone pretty recently. We had an entire team of tanks versus an entire team of squishies. And someone asked halfway through the game, hey, where's our damage output coming from? And I responded with, no, we have enough. And all we did was look at one target and say, you die. And that target died. And then we wait for next rotation of cooldown and say, all right, this target dies. And during those rotation cooldowns, no one had the ability to kill us. But we could look at someone and say that they should die. So in a similar context, all you need is enough damage. That is, again, a game theory concept that very much functions more in MOBAs above all else. And the reason I wanted to touch on that one in particular is because it functions in MOBAs above all else, and you want to focus on League for the most part. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Just a quick recap on the game designs or game theory stuff. First off, game theory is fluid. It has the ability to transition between multiple different games, right? So especially when you're looking at games of similar types, you can look at something and actively say, okay, this is how this gets played out. This is how this gets played out. This is how this gets played out. Now transition into the new MOBA. How well does this function? Still exactly a similar concept. Is there any reason to deviate from this? So in Smite, we use the example of junglers are much, much faster because you can share XP, you can share gold. Awesome. Time to kill camps is infinitely shorter, and map is slightly smaller. So the game gets more heavily accelerated. So you can't say, well, I'm just going to perma-farm. Farming your routes is still there. Where people play is still there. Other conceptual concepts, that was a stupid phrase, are still there. But we just need to swap up this one tiny thing, and all of a sudden, all the other pieces fit perfectly into place still. And everything works out fine. I also just realized I have alerts on. Those should be off. I'm taking this as a VOD. Thank you, Brad, though. So, and then also the need just enough damage conceptually makes sense, right? As well?
Yep.
You get ahead on Renekton, there's no point to continue building lethality Renekton. You are overkilling your target. Awesome. So, now off of the overarching game theory, and again, this is also, we are touching on things in a much shorter fashion, because just to put into perspective, this first section right here took about 30 minutes. If we were to touch on all game theory as an overarching everything, this can very easily become a 6.5 hour long conversation, if not longer.
A full semester class.
Yeah. So, off of that, we are touching more on the basics and then giving you the opportunity to be, and the thought process to be able to expand on that knowledge in off time. Because, again, we don't have all the time in the world to be able to do it.
This is true.
Mm-hmm. All right. So off of this now, we're going to transition that. I just saw that. It's just a theory, a game theory, and I hate you, Mike. With this, we're now going to transition into how that functions into just League in particular. And the best way game theory functions the League in particular is the champs and the items, and how they function with each other, right? So, we're going to start off with the funnest one of all. One of my most hated champions, but I love to play him. Volibear. What does Volibear do? What is his purpose in life?
So he's got some CC. He's a decent bruisey frontliner. Leans on the tankier side. He can turn off turrets with his ultimate. He's got a pretty gnarly Q that if he gets hit by CC, it resets so he can
I'm going to cut you off for
again.
half a second.
Okay.
You're going too much in description. What is his main purpose in life? This should be a one-sentence answer.
He dive.
He goes in. Right. That's what he's looking to do. He's looking to look at someone and say, you get stunned and you die. That is his goal in life. Realistically, everything else is kind of additional things. Like, we can say he's tanky, we can say he has the additional shield, we can say he has the slow, we can say he turns off turrets, but realistically, he is looking at a target and saying, you are dying. That is his purpose in life. And how does he have to accomplish that purpose? Hello?
Sorry, I don't know what the hell was going on with my mic there. So basically, he can kind of just go in with his abilities, and if he kind of dumps his kit, he should be able to get to where he needs to be.
Cool. Get slightly more descriptive with that. How does he do it? Because you said use his abilities. What does his abilities do? How does he conduct himself?
So he
Short version.
Typically, he wants to try to be starting it out of vision and set up his Q. Either that or set up his E, then pop his Q, or pop his E while using his Q so that it's not seen. He then will use either the speed from that to get into it with, say, popping Predator, or he'll use his ultimate to get into a proper position, set off a turret, get behind things, try and hop on their carry. It's kind of situational, like which target that he takes on, but depending on where he's at, as far as like if he has a lead or if he's behind, then his role can kind of be a bit more flexible. But for the most part, you want him to be diving to stun a carry and hopefully get off enough damage to kill them.
Okay. So in that entire explanation, you went a little more in detail than what was needed, and you also missed the exact sentence that's required. He has to run at you. That's a massive differential comparatively to other characters, because when you're saying he can use the movement speed to be able to get on top of people, you could say that was Zed. Zed has Yumu's Ghost Blade, and dash or blinks on top of someone, then blinks a second time on top of someone, then blinks out. It's still the same thing that you described for all intents and purposes. Running at someone and having the ability to dash or blink or find different ways on top of someone, those are vastly differential. And if you're using your 3-minute cooldown ultimate to jump on top of someone, that's not a very consistent way to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Volibear, realistically, we can now establish is a champion that looks to say, I'm going to kill an individual target, you are going to get stunned, and I have to run at you to do it. So, thematically, that is what he does. Right? We can say all the other stuff about his kit, but in all reality, that is what he does. That is his main purpose in life. Everything else is just icing on the cake to help him achieve that goal. So let's think about that for a second, right? Volibear wants to run directly at someone. How do you beat that?
You stun him.
Okay. So one way is you can use crowd control to be able to dissuade him from coming in. If someone's going to run directly at you, you have the option to say no to that. You have the option to say no in many ways to that off of the CC. That's correct. What's another way to be able to deal with it?
You can silence him. You can get someone to peel your carry.
All right, that's still all in the CC category, so same concept. There's one other big way. I'll give you a hint. If you have a 50 cal and I have a shotgun, how does that work?
The 50 cal is going to blow your arm off.
Right. So what happens if it's Zoe, Jace, Ezreal, all those champions, and Volibear's like, I'm going to run at you.
He's never going to get there. He's too far away.
Exactly.
You just snipe him out.
There's also the difference between running at people and then the blink concept. Running at people is a very, very poor way to be able to actually find and engage. It's very, very difficult to be able to do. Because any crowd control immediately nopes you. Any long range stuff immediately nopes you, if they space correctly, right? So thematically, when someone has to run directly into you, you have a lot of options to deal with, right? So now let's swap up the tables a little bit, right? Since we talked about pokey people, so the Jace, the Zoe, things like that, we can now establish that their thematic is poke, right? What beats that?
Probably the blink side of things. Something that can close the distance without being hit.
Yeah. Long-range gap closers. So you can look at Malphite Ultimate. You can look at Hecarim E plus Ultimate. You can look at Zed W plus Ultimate. That's a very far distance to be able to cover. Things like that. Right? Because there's no way for the poke to be able to deal with that because thematically as well, we can look at Volibear and say, okay, he has to run directly at the target. That's his entire purpose in life. Remember, all the other abilities just kind of enable that. So now we get into that bigger description that you gave earlier, right? So Volibear is a beefier person. Now you say he's on the tankier side. That's 100% correct. That's how the rest of his kit enables his thematic. So then with pokey people, what enables their thematic?
Probably their obnoxious range.
Yeah. It's their long range and their oomph in burst. So that means they're lacking tankiness. They're lacking mobility. Because what happens if you have a mage who is hypermobile and a tank?
You have yourself a very broken champion.
Oh yeah, you're first picking that shit every game. And similar concept, what happens if we have a thing that says, you as an individual target will die, I am incredibly beefy, and now I have 2 dashes?
Ouch.
You're picking that every game as well, right?
Yep.
So similar concept, thematically, things have a purpose in life. That is their goal, right? And with that goal, they have things to be able to enable that goal. if they have things from outside thematics, all of a sudden, you have something that's a massive problem. I'm going to give a great example of that. Do you remember when Akali got reworked?
Yes.
Let's give her a way to not be hit whatsoever. Let's give her insanely high damage output. Let's give her 17 dashes that are not point and click at that current time. They are anywhere whatsoever. So now you have damage output, tankiness, and high mobility that overkills targets very significantly so you can build even tankier. You have a problem, child.
Yes.
There we go. Excuse me. So, with this, let's expand on this concept a little bit, right? So we can see that, okay, bruisers have low mobility and are tanky. Any bruiser with high mobility, all of a sudden you're running into massive issues, right? So remember when Stridebreaker was that 90% slow? Anyone that got near you, you're dead. When Stridebreaker was the dash initially, and Darius could just get on top of you for free, we have a problem. Yep. It's not when we're looking at Poke. Poke has high burst, high range. That's their purpose in life, right? What other thematics do we have? Even if you just pick a champion and you start thinking about what thematic they are, what else we got?
Well, I mean, you got Scion.
Okay.
He's a choo-choo train that's also a brick wall.
Yeah, so Scion is a tank for all intents and purposes, right?
Yep.
And what do tanks have?
Tanks have quite a bit of CC abilities. They have pretty low damage, lower mobility, but my goodness, do they have a big health pool, and they typically are high in armor and magic resistance.
Yeah. That's 100% correct, right? Tanks are high crowd control, low damage, low mobility, very tanky. If you have all of a sudden a hyper-mobile tank, guess what? You have Maokai from Season 3 with Sivir Ultimate and Karma Shield, and they run at Mach 4 with Righteous Glory. Oh god, it's found your backline. You now have a crowd-controlled backline for 17 years. And it got there for free. We have a problem. What happens when tanks have too high of damage output? Well, then we go back to preseason when Sunfire Cape was literally just microwaving people. And that was a problem. And when you look at the tanks in current meta, you can kind of look and see like, okay, if a tank has to have high crowd control and be very tanky, like much tankier than a bruiser in order to be justifiable, let's put Maokai into perspective. Maokai has really high CC, pretty decent damage, man mobility. He has his W for moving around the map, but that's about it. The reason he's not played in top lane is he's not tanky. He's just so squishy he can't be played. So then, similar concept, if you want something with high crowd control, why don't you just pick a bruiser? There are bruisers with high crowd control too. That are tankier than Maokai, and now deal more damage. So what's ever the purpose to pick Maokai in the top lane role? There's not. He ruins his own thematic of why you would want to pick him. And we'll get into moments like how that functions here in a second too, because we're going to talk about itemization as well in this similar context. So, what other thematics do we have? Did it just delete my T? It did. What? I'm not crazy, right? It is deleting my thing?
Yeah, I think maybe the cursor was out of place. There you go.
Maybe. There we go. Yeah. What other thematics do we have? We'll go one more and then we'll start talking about itemization.
You got attack damage carries, ADCs. So,
yeah. So we'll go with auto attack carries.
Yep.
Because there are spellcaster carries, and that's a completely separate thematic. They do vastly separate things. So what do these people have? What do they have going for them?
Typically, they are very immobile. They have huge outbursts of damage, very high attack speed, but they are also very squishy.
High DPS and squishy. Yes! That is what we're looking at. When you're looking at an auto attack based carry, you're looking for the highest DPS in the game. There might be some mages that also fit that thematic, so Cassiopeia and Azir come to mind. Those are also DPS mages that are trying to fit that thematic. If you're thinking Smite, you're looking at Oleron and Soul. Those people, also Kronos, I believe. Yeah, he's still an auto attack based character. that kind of stuff. But they are designed to be immobile, because what happens if you have an incredibly high damage output thing that is super mobile?
Then you have a problem, because then you can't really, pin it down.
Yep, great
It's too
example.
slippery.
Yeah, great example. Samira on release, where she could dash through allies. You ganked her, she just dashed through her own minion wave. Didn't care. She's safe. Just fine. Nothing mattered to her. All right. They also require a high DPS. So what happens if an auto attack carry doesn't have a high enough DPS? Well, then they either have to make up for it in some other way, or they're just not viable. Ashe in current state. Ashe doesn't do enough damage to feel useful, and her utility in current state is not good enough. Jhin just does her job better. And then they are basically required to be squishy. What happens if you have a super tanky AD carry? Well, we're looking at release Samira again, where 1 Q was 400 life on a wave at 1 item. Yay! That's fun to deal with. So, now with this concept in mind, right? So with the game theory and champion thematics all put together, you can now start functioning off of that. So for instance, we'll go with Smite to start with, right? They require very high tempo to be able to play mid and jungle. So if you require high tempo to play mid and jungle, you can start looking for champions with those thematics. What type of champions want to snowball very, very quickly and get going and just murk things? It's not on the list, by the way.
Pretty much anything that would be like in the later game. A lot of like mage carries definitely want that early game lead so that they can get it rolling later on. Because if they can get there safely, then they're gonna pop the hell off.
Ooh,
Unless you're talking about assassins, because then they'd be doing really well if they get an early game lead, because they can take that lead into the mid game.
I was about to say, let's just touch on that real quick, since you brought up 2 points, and the first point you brought up was an incorrect thought process. So, let's, for all intents and purposes, give things an arbitrary power level. Don't worry about the champions. Don't worry about what's being played. We're just going to give an arbitrary power level. And then from there, we can apply it to specific circumstances. So, if something has an arbitrary power level of 6 and something has an arbitrary power level of 8, who wins the fight?
8.
So what happens if this 6 is the mid-jungle duo on one team and this 8 is the mid-jungle duo on the other team? How does this 6 get through the early game when the 8 says, we're going to bully you off of everything in existence? You don't get to touch the wave. You don't get to touch your camps because you're always on the back foot. You don't get to ever fight us because you're always on the back foot and we're stronger than you. So how does the 6 ever get functioning when the game basically ends at 10 minutes in Smite?
I would imagine that it just never would then.
Right. So if that's the case, when the game goes very, very quickly, the concept of having later game scaling stuff scale for free doesn't exist because the game is too fast paced. When we swap over to League side now your concept makes a lot more sense because the game is slower paced. With the game being slower paced, things have more time to scale. You can give up more things. You can afford to be on the back foot. And with that, scaling is higher in existence. Especially now with objective bounties, where you can fall even farther behind. And all it takes is one little fight to bring you back. Back to neutrality. You can win one dragon fight and you're back. Lose the first 3 dragons, win the 4th, you're back in the game. That allows for scaling. So whenever you don't have the option for scaling, you're looking towards early game stuff. If you're looking towards early game stuff, you're looking towards assassins mostly, because what happens if they get a slight lead? Game's over.
They snowball, yeah.
They're just going to start murking everything, because again, the game ends by 10 minutes, so they never have a chance to fall off. The other thing you're looking towards are bruisers. Because bruisers have really, really high base numbers, and they love getting accelerated. They love keeping ahead of the curve, because they're so heavy when it comes to itemization and levels. Which, by the way, when I mention heavy, I mean they're very resource dependent. So the best example I can give of that is Mordekaiser. For every item he gets infinitely stronger. For every level he gets, even if he doesn't put a point into Q, his main ability gets stronger. Bruisers love base levels, so they require to be ahead of the curve. They love items, so they require to be ahead of the curve. If they are neutral with the opponents, they will naturally fall off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, that is how you apply champion thematics into the game theory of what is actually being applied. And you can transition this very, very easily. So again, you learn the game is faster paced, you're looking more towards bruisers, you're looking more towards assassins. Right? If the game is slower paced, you're looking more towards scaling, you're looking more towards tanks, you're looking more towards hyper carries, things like that. And based on how itemization is and how, like, when the game is actually ending and how resources get divvied out, because also in Smite, realistically, you get much higher gold per second, and you also get more gold per camps, more gold per minions than League, so even that part of the game becomes much more accelerated. And with all of that combined, you can take a couple seconds and think, okay, what type of stuff is actually required to be able to function under this pace of game? And no matter what the meta shifts to, no matter what patches come out, that's all that has to be applied to determine what type of classification of characters are being played. Except for one thing. One thing can throw everything I just said out the window. And that's the next thing we're going to talk about. Itemization and numbers. Because now let's start thinking about this next step, right? So we established in Smite, for instance, that it's very early game focused, it's very fast paced, so you're looking towards assassins and bruisers, right? What happens if tanks just straight up have higher numbers than bruisers in the early and mid game? And then they also scale better.
Then they're just the auto take. They're broken.
Right. There's no reason to play bruisers. Even though bruisers thematically are what's supposed to fit in that role, you can go to any game whatsoever, and bruisers will have a good early mid game, fall off late game. Tanks are supposed to be meh early game, really good mid game, acceptable late game. But there's just no point to pick bruisers under that classification, because the numbers just aren't there. Right? And now with that as well, what happens if tanks are weaker than bruisers in the early game, as they should be, but there's an item that's a first item for most builds that's just absurdly broken for tanks? Now the time to end the game, or like when the game ends, if it's at 10 minutes, generally you still have one item by that point. So if you can hit one item by the time where it's like, all right, game determining fight time, and that one item is so absurdly broken, you get ahead of you're stronger than the opponents, you are allowed to pick that. The best example I can give of that is, do you remember when Ezreal was really, really strong? He was going Triforce, Muramana, or even Iceborne Gauntlet, Muramana, that kind of a build during that era.
Yep.
All right. So during that time period, Ezreal's Muramana transformed by about 18 minutes generally. What happens at about 18 minutes in a normal League game?
Around that time, you're looking at, oh geez, isn't it has to do with an objective, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Isn't that when Baron spawns?
Nope, Baron spawns at 20.
Oh, okay.
At 18 minutes, we are looking at third dragon. So, during that time period where Ezreal was absurdly broken, the game-determining fight was at third dragon. Ezreal came online at 2 items. Once he had Muramana, he was a monster of a champion. So because the game was determined exactly when Ezreal spiked up like crazy, he became the most valuable champion in the game. And you can pick any champions you want that also fit around that fight timing. You can play anything that just needs to get to 2 items and fight at that dragon, and you can win the game off of it. You also have the option to say, I want to win the game before that third dragon exists. That's just a much harder playstyle because the burden of execution is insanely high on you comparatively. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now, excuse me. With this, you can also think about how items interact with the game. So just like we have champion thematics, right? And we understand that numbers can very quickly throw this off in both like itemization and in champion concepts, along with just arbitrary numbers or generally arbitrary numbers. So you're looking at like the experience in the game, the gold in the game, right? Things that aren't normally thought about. Those can very quickly determine what champions can also be viable. So when you're looking at itemization, we have to think about what's viable in that as well. And the best example I can give of that is Gore Drinker. Remember when Gore Drinker was basically built on 4 out of 5 champions every game?
Yep.
Yeah. So, with that item being absurdly broken, what champions built that item?
Like literally everybody. Because you had, I think the best example that I can think of, and the one that made me the most frustrated, was seeing Talons taking Gore Drinker
Talon and Kiana,
consistently.
yep.
Because they have these huge amounts of burst damage. They get enough AD that they could still do a lot with them. And then they had really high mobility kits so they could just get in and get out without having to worry about anything. But they also had that healing so they could actually stay in if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right? And that Gore Drinker gave that thematic of, I'm going to be a beefy person, I'm going to go into the opponents, and I'm going to have the ability to heal up quite a bit to stay in the extended fight. That was its thematic, right? And because it was such a strong item, it determined the entire playstyle and the entire meta around it to the point where everybody had to play that thematic, right? So with this as well, there were ways to deal with Gore Drinker. They were very difficult because the item was so broken, but let's assume that we reduce the item value to a standard item, right? It's not incredibly broken, but people are still taking it. And people are still picking the same champions, right? How do you then deal with that? You have 2 options.
I'm not particularly certain of that.
Okay. Option 1 comes down to you can draft a team that can deal with that thematic. So if they are picking champions that are required to build Gore Drinker, they're going to go into a fight, they're going to try to sustain through that fight. You can pick things that say, no, you're not allowed to do that. You can pick things like Soraka that say, I out-sustain you. Your Gore Drinker is irrelevant. My team is tankier. I can silence you to prevent your healing. You can pick things that are counter-engaged like Zyra. I'm going to CC you so you don't have the chance to be able to escape or even fight in the middle of this. You're just going to drop. The second option is there any itemization that deals with that thematic? So the best example I can give of that, comparatively to Gore Drinker, is right now Force of Nature is absurdly broken, as long as it's built in the correct circumstance. If someone gets hit 6 times by magic damage, or if they get crowd controlled, it counts as 2 stacks, they take 20% reduced magic damage. Just straight up. It already has 70 magic resist on it. It's already very, very strong versus APs. So versus a Cassiopeia, for instance, if a tank builds Force of Nature, they can walk at the Cassiopeia and not care. The entire thematic of the AP hyper carries, that's consistent damage, is completely null and void in current state. You can't play it. It's not possible. Any bruisers, any tanks, Force of Nature, they're invincible to you. Itemization can also hard counter thematics. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Another example of that is Karthus in existence, right? What itemization would be able to counter Karthus? You have kind of 2 options. One I'm going to give as a more in general sense. What are you thinking?
My least favorite item in the game, Zanya's Hourglass.
Yeah, so that's going to be the overarching one that I want to touch on. Preventative measures, right? So you have Zonias, you have Locket, you have Redemption. There are ways for people to build those kind of items to be able to say, your ultimate's just worthless. Your entire purpose in life is just gone. So what's the other option to deal with a Karthus? It's still itemization, by the way. It's just not alt preventative measure, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll give you a hint. This is a very, very easy and obvious answer. This is like the brain dead one.
Oh. See, this is the kind of thing that, like, when I hear it, I'm gonna be really mad because right now I cannot think of it to save my life. Anything that would give you like a spell shield?
Nope, that's the preventative measure for ultimate. So that'd be
Right.
Banshee's Veil, for instance, or Crown, or the other one that I can't think of, Edge of Night.
Edge of Night.
So you're facing an AP character. What do you build?
Magic resistance.
There you go.
God. Okay.
So you have multiple options to be able to deal with Karthus in whatever is required. So if you need to deal with his ultimate, you're looking towards Zonias, you're looking towards Banshees, Edge of Night, Locket, Redemption, that kind of stuff, right? And you can Crown, you can deal with his ultimate in that regard if that's your goal. If you need to deal with him as an in general sense, how does a 300 Locket shield stop the 600 damage Qs? It's not going to do anything. How does the 400 redemption healing stop the 600 damage Qs? How does the Zonias stop him from queuing you immediately after the Zonias is done? None of that applies to the rest of Karthus. So you have multiple ways to deal with him based on what you're trying to accomplish, right? And that is the entire goal of itemization. Because, fun fact, when my players ask me like, hey, what's the best item? I generally take a half second to think about it. I don't just magically know the answer. That doesn't exist. Because off of that, you have to think about, first off, what thematic does the opponent have? Are they coming into us? Are we all stacking? Is it isolated environments? Do we need to kill this super specific hyper carry and just deal with him? Do they have a very specific crowd control that we have to deal with? Right? Are they magic damage heavy? Are they physical damage heavy? Are they 4 AD, 1 AP so we can go with Thenemas? Right? All that is based off of dealing with their thematic. Then once we figure out their thematic of what we want to deal with, then we have to determine what is the highest value we can get for our gold. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the best example I can give of this is, let's say there are literally 5 AD carries, all range characters. You are a melee person who has to run at them, so you will never touch them. What armor item should you build? Let me rephrase this. You will, just for clarity's sake, you will never be able to reach them under normal circumstances. You're a Volibear to all of those characters. We'll put it that way.
Well, in regards to trying to get through that, I would think that the answer would be either trying to stack more movement speed on them. So it would be something along the lines of using, plated steel caps or dead man's. Shit like that, or you would want to use something like something that would slow their auto attacks. So maybe blanking on the names of
Frozen Heart, Ronduins?
Yes, thank you.
So here's the fun part. Your first answer was correct. Because realistically, if you're never going to be in range of the opponents, assuming they play halfway decently, how do they ever get in range of Frozen Heart? How do they ever get in range of the Ronduins active? It doesn't exist. So mathematically, Dead Man's Plate is the worst armor item you can build that's not a support item. It gives the lowest value for its stats. But the worst armor item in the game is the best armor item in that circumstance, because none of the other items are even relevant.
Right.
And that is the thematic concept. And in order to do correct itemization, you have to have both the thematic concept of what needs to be, or what is required to function, and the math to be able to say what is the best option out of the choices. So let's swap it up from 5 AD carries to 5 melees. 5 AD melees. If that's the case, immediately Dead Man's is thrown out the window. Why do you need to chase down melees who are going to come into you?
You don't have to.
Right. So then from there, it's, okay, do we need Frozen Heart, which is pure armor and attack speed slow, or do we need Ronduins, which is health plus armor, reducing AD, and reducing crit with a little bit of a slow. But the slow is less relevant because they're melees. They're on top of you. You're fighting them at that point. So it's based on what's more required at that point. There's where the math part comes in. And again, that is the thematic concept of what we need to deal with, then apply the math to it. And normally, if you're doing the thematic concept correct, the math has a lot less value in it. The best example I can give of that is, if you're a support and you require Mikhails, you're probably building Mikhails. If you're building Mikhails as a support, you have literally 0 life. That is just the reality. But Mikhails, in some circumstances, is so valuable, you sacrifice your own base stats in order to accept the fact that you have to do that. And that's more of a support concept. But even in other lanes, there are times where items are so valuable, thematically, that you just have to pick them up. It's just kind of required. Excuse me. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So again, similar concept. Let's do a quick recap. Champions have their own individual thematics. It's not their entire kit. It's what they do. And that is the most important concept. Excuse me. Something else we didn't touch on, by the way, just as a quick note. Champions can have more than one thematic. Zyra is poke and counter engage. Super long range. Fits everything that's poke. If people come into her, she presses R. People can't come into her. It's not an option without suiciding. Brand, similar concept. Poke, counter engage. Same thing. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then from there, with champions having their thematic, and the game also having its concepts that have to be applied, you can determine what thematics are the most valuable in a type of game based on, again, what is functioning the most, what itemization is good, how long the game is going, what breakpoints do champions get to that determine the game state, right? Then from there, you can create thematics to also beat those thematics. So for instance, if bruisers are really, really strong and they get on your face, they jump on you, cool, how strong is counter engage? How strong is poke? Are either of those relevant? If so, we now have something to deal with the broken way. And we're perfectly fine in that regard. And we have a way to function around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then from there, similar concept, itemization. More based on thematics than math. Math is still valuable. Never ignore the math. All right. Let me actually type this out real quick. All right. So the next section we were going to go over was applying numbers to thematics. We kind of just did that for the most part.
Right. That was the concept that we were going over just then. And
yeah,
then,
for the itemization in particular.
Right.
Before it gets more value. So I'm going to give a couple more examples of that, and then I'm also going to touch on champions and why they fit their thematic mathematically, which we touched on very slightly, but not nearly enough. So the example I'm going to give for itemization is Spirit Visage versus, my brain's dying, Force of Nature. Both of them prevent damage. They just prevent damage in different ways. So Spirit Visage, I'm actually going to pull this up on my main monitor real quick. Let me get Force of Nature as well. Okay. Also, Wiki, beautiful tool. All right. So we're going to look at this. So Spirit Visage, right? Its way to increase... Go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah.
Okay.
We're looking at Spirit Visage. Yeah.
So Spirit Visage, its way to make you tankier and basically prevent damage for all intents and purposes is it increases your healing and shielding, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your shield goes from 1,000 to 1,250, for all intents and purposes, you have prevented an additional 250 damage. That is its contribution to that. If you get healed by the same amount, yada, 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 right?
Right.
Force of Nature, its way of preventing damage is through this 20% value. It also has higher magic resist, and I believe higher life. No, it's 100 life shorter. So just higher magic resist, right? Also with this, you have bonus movement speed to be able to dodge stuff. That can be valuable, but in general, I don't like to count this little movement speed as dodging abilities. If you're going to dodge the ability, you're probably dodging the ability regardless. The 10% bonus movement speed plus the 5%, that's enough to justify it. That is quite a bit. But anyways, so just looking at this in particular, right? This is the example I love to use when comparing itemization mathematically. If you are Tom Kench, which gives you more value?
That is a good question. Go over to Spirit Visage again one more time.
Absolutely. 100
The
bonus
Spirit
life?
Visage.
Ah. So there's the fun part. There is no correct answer unless we go into an exact circumstance. And in that exact circumstance, more likely than not, you're probably not doing the math in game. No one would.
Right.
That's kind of the reality. So, we have to start thinking about that, right?
Right.
And here's where...
then it's the application of the thematic, correct?
Yeah, it is. There we go. So, application of thematic, right? If you have no other healers on your team and your shielding is not being broken already, why would we ever build Spirit Visage over top of Force of Nature? If your shield is getting broken frequently and it's by burst damage, so it's a Vagar looking at you, right? He's just QWing you and you're having to pop your shield to make sure you don't die to his ultimate. Force of Nature never stacks it up. It never happens. Right? And in most circumstances where you're debating between these two items, a lot of the times it literally just comes down to the thematic and trying to figure it out. So for instance, if you have a Soraka on your team, this will never, ever be more than Spirit Visage. Never. Spirit Visage will always outdo it. Every single day of the week. Excuse me. You can have a Cassiopeia on the opposing team just wailing on you. Doesn't matter. This increased healing with a Soraka, because she heals so much, will just outdo it straight up. Again, that's where the fun comes in, where if my players ask me a question in the middle of scrims, they're just like, hey, what should I build? Thematic overrules math. Math then gets applied to determine which piece of the thematic works the best. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Awesome. This is, again, the best example I have of this by far, because even I can look at a moment in game and be like, oh, both can function.
Right.
And there is an actual mathematically correct answer. It's just so hard to be able to do it for each individual circumstance that normally I would have to do it after the game. But if it's after the game, it's already too late.
Right. I think one of my big questions is, right, and it's something that I consistently think about because of just what the item does in practice, but Athenemas in particular, I feel like that's like it has a specific usage.
Yes.
But as for the math, not the thematic, I feel like is there really a reason that a tank wouldn't take that? Like, it just feels like if you are able to put that on the highest damage output from the opposing team for its gold price, I feel like that's pretty much a no-brainer almost every game. Because what would you, like, not get from having that, other than, of course, if for some reason their gold is evenly split throughout their team, which in most cases shouldn't be the case.
Correct.
Then what, like, you know, why would that be a bad thing to take that over, say, something that wouldn't be giving you nearly as much damage resistance against that carry in particular?
Okay. So here, I'm going to pull up a draft real quick that can explain this very easily. So, first off, what is the thematic of Athenemas? It does two things in particular.
So, the big thing that the item concentrates on is that you pick a target, and after a certain amount of time, you've gathered enough stacks that you will reduce the incoming damage from them from, I believe, what is it again, 30 or 40%? 30%.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, and what's the second piece of that? Because it does something else whenever it's fully stacked. I can also pull up the wiki if you want me to.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because I can't remember right now.
I spelled it very wrong.
Close enough. We'll get there.
Nope.
Oh, boy.
There we go. It's an A, not an E. There we go. It's the vengeance part at the bottom.
It also reduces tenacity.
Yeah.
Which is very gross.
UCC people for longer. It's literally a fuck you button to a singular target. They don't hurt you and they get CC'd for longer.
Yep.
Yes. So, in moments where you would not want to build this, would consist of compositions where there are multiple carries that are completely destroying you. So if you build just Athenemas, it saves you from one, not the other. Or ones that are very heavy in true damage, because true damage is going to ignore the 30%, so it doesn't matter.
Gotcha.
So let's put this into perspective. Let's first off build a composition in which case you would not want to build Venomous because their damage output is split. So let's have Aatrox. Let's have Nidalee. Let's have Cass. Let's have Aphelios. And support is arbitrary. Doesn't matter, Leona. If you build a Venomous, who are you putting it on?
If it were me in the game, depending on who's like in the lead between Cassiopeia or Aphelios.
Okay. So let's assume net neutrality, where everything is 0-0-0, standard farm, 10 farm a minute. Because realistically, if we assume people are magically accelerated, we can make that argument for any champion in the game under any circumstance, and then things become very wishy-washy very quickly if we just assume bad play. We can assume winning matchups should win, but assuming neutrality is the easiest way to be able to do this.
Then that's where my question was coming in, and it's like, I know I'm asking about like when would you not build the Thenemas, but my question would be like, if per se you put this into practice in like a draft game, and you just look at every single draft game you ever do, and there's more often than not there is someone on the enemy team who has a significantly higher lead, isn't it beneficial to slap that Athenemas on them instead of looking at a different item?
That's where the rest of the math comes into play.
Right.
So very, very good question. So let's start with this, for instance, right? So you're at Ornn, right? Let's assume net neutrality here for a second, and then we'll go into the math here in a second as well. So if we have neutrality, we're clearly building one of the mythics first. We're going either Iceborne or Sunfire Cape. And right now, in current state, Sunfire Cape is a little better just because they kneecapped Iceborne Gauntlet. So, if that's the case, and we have Iceborne Gauntlet now we have to decide between armor, magic resist, or just straight up life. Realistically, if we're leaning against the Aatrox, we're probably leaning more towards armor. Although, unfortunately, Nidalee is in the game as well, and that can cause us some issues. But again, we'll be interacting with Aatrox the most. So let's say we're going armor next, right? If we're going armor next, then we would realistically want to pick up Ronduins, right? So if we're looking thematically at it, if we build Deadman's, doesn't matter. That's pretty short range. We're getting on top of Cassiopeia if we want to. We're not getting on top of Nidalee no matter how much we want to. That's coming into us. That's coming into us. So Ronduins is most valuable because you can reduce the AD of Aatrox by 10%, which come mid-game is about 50. He hits 500 AD pretty consistently at like 4 items-ish around that area. Then Aphelios, similar concept. We can get on him if we want to. We can just ult him. We can E on top of him. Activate Deadman or Ronduins, 10% crit reduction. Awesome. Fantastic. So then past that point, now we need magic resist because we're assuming neutrality. If we're assuming neutrality and we're looking at that Cassiopeia right there, we're probably building Force of Nature. Because now mathematically, if we look at Athenemas, this reduces our damage output we take from her by 30%. If we have... I think I still have it open, don't I? I do. Wonderful. If we have Force of Nature here, this will be instantaneously stacked. That's just going to be the reality. So if this is instantaneously stacked, we take 20% reduced damage from Cassiopeia by having this item. We also gain 70 magic resist. Do you know how magic resist and armor work in League?
Isn't it one value of armor will block one value of damage, or is it that it blocks in percentages? I can't remember.
It blocks in percentages.
Okay. So with MR, it blocks a lower percentage of the magic damage that you take in than armor does to AD.
Nope, it's the same.
Oh, it is?
Yep. So here's the easiest way to describe it. For every point of armor or MR you have, again, they're exactly the same, your effective life increases by 1%. So at 100 armor versus AD, you have 100% bonus life. So if you have double your life, it's 50% damage reduction. Does that math make sense to you?
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, I can pull up on Notepad too. So if you have 100 armor, you have 100% bonus life. So for instance, if you had, I'm accidentally drawing. So if you had 1,000 life and 100 armor, you now have 2,000 life versus AD. That's your effective health pool versus physical damage. Your actual numeric health is 1,000, but your functional health is 2,000 because for each point of armor, it increases your health by 1%. So if we change this to 1,500 effective life versus physical damage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's starting to make more sense, guys.
Okay. So now with this kind of a math, right? So if we have 100 armor, 100% value, you've doubled your life. If you've doubled your life, you are taking 50% reduced damage. Because they have to cut through double your life pool. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then if you have 200 armor, your life pool goes up to 3,000. It's 1,000 plus 1,000 plus 1,000. It's increased by 200%. So if you have triple your life pool, you have 2/3 reduction. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So your first 100 armor value is worth 50% damage reduction. The second 100 armor value is worth 16.6 repeating armor value. Armor and health, or armor and magic resist has heavy diminishing returns. Does that make sense?
Yes. So
Okay.
in theory, you should be looking to get to the point where you're getting your maximum bonus or your maximum return. Then comes in the term min-maxing. So you're minimizing the amount that you have to take to get the maximum output, and then you would just start going for health, or you'd be looking for whatever stat otherwise.
Right. Generally, that breakpoint value is about 275 before pen comes in. Because if you're applying pen, then all of a sudden, you still want to hit that 275 value. You know, if someone has high percent pen, you're never actually going to hit that unless you're Malphite or Ornn kind of thing. But generally, about 275, you're going to start building life over top of resistances because it gives you more value. But anyways, so let's look at this real quick with Force of Nature. Even if we had 100 value or 100 MR before we bought this item, right? We get 20% reduction from this. Then we get 70 MR, right? So if we go from 100 to 170, realistically, that is going to give us more than 10% reduction. If it's giving us more than 10% reduction, Force of Nature outdoes Athenima's in damage reduction. Now we have to take into consideration, remember that draft from before? Let me pull that back up real quick. I think it was, which one was it? I think it was Athenima's. Yeah, here we go. When we're looking at this now, that 70 MR value doesn't just get applied to the Cassiopeia. Remember that. That 20% reduction doesn't just get applied to Cassiopeia. It gets applied to Nidalee. It gets applied to Aphelios has some magic damage in his kit. It applies to all of Leona. It applies to everyone. So if you were to build Athenima's third item, Nidalee can still kill you. Leona's damage is still relevant. Some Aphelios damage is still relevant. Force of Nature nullifies all three. Now, past that point, you now have a heavy armor item. You have a heavy MR item. You have a mix item in Frostfire Gauntlet. Now you can start looking towards health items. Because you're probably very close to... You're probably like 250 armor and MR on Ornn by that stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then if that's the case, do we care about 30% damage reduction when it stacks multiplicatively? So what I mean by that is, if someone does 100 damage to you, right? Let's do it this way. They deal 100 damage to you. It gets reduced by 50% because of resistances. So they deal...
Yep. Yes.
by 50%. Now this 50 gets reduced by 30%. So you're dealing what, like mid-30s damage? I'm doing math wrong in my head. I'm definitely doing math wrong in my head. It's like mid-30s damage, right? So I'm just going to put 34 arbitrarily. I could pull out a calculator. My brain's not functioning right now. But that's how multiplicative works. So do we really care about that 16 reduced damage from building Athenima's over top of building something that can give us more value? Where we can go towards Frozen Heart. If Aphelios is the problem, if we build Frozen Heart, that 20% or 20% attack speed slow will outdo Athenima's.
Got it.
That's where you would not want to build it. Where you have better options in place of that deal with more things. So if we swap it up to your theory of what happens if one is incredibly fed. What happens if we look at this and say, that's the wrong one. We look at this and say, all right, this Aphelios is stupid fed. Aatrox is put in the dirt. So it's magic damage, stupid fed, magic damage. Those are the only relevant ones. Cool. Then we have to think thematically. Are we interacting with Aphelios? If the answer is yes and he's stupid fed and he can shred through us, we might be looking at Athenema's time. Then past Athenema's on Aphelios, we would look towards the Force of Nature now to be able to deal with the other people. If it's Aphelios fed and Aatrox fed, we just look towards armor. We don't look towards Athenema's, because then Aatrox is still a problem. If multiple are fed, we have to pick thematically which one are we dealing with the most and what's causing the most issues. So sometimes Athenema's is relevant, sometimes it is not. The times where Athenema's is always relevant is whenever you are facing a sole source of damage output that Force of Nature, because Force of Nature is currently broken, cannot deal with. So let's swap this up. So let's say this is Lee Sin.
I think we had this discussion before where we were talking about, this was a while ago, but Karthus, we were talking about how, like, let's say there's 4 AD on their team, and then they have a Karthus. You just target him with the Venemas, and you're good.
Yep, that's a perfect example. So here, if Karthus is fed, you would build Venemas first. If not, you're building armor first. And either way, you're going Ninja Tabby into armor, so you're at least going to have some armor with that plus your Mythic. And this makes Karthus irrelevant to you.
Yep.
Oddball side. Keep in mind that when we had that talk before, Force of Nature was not in the game. Force of Nature is now in the game and very relevant. So if you're just playing for Karthus Ultimate, Athenema's beats it out. If you're looking towards everything else from Karthus, he is spamming magic damage. There's also incidental magic damage that can stack it up. So Leona Izu, that's a magic damage source and a crowd control source. She just gave you 3 stacks instantaneously. Because remember as well, Force of Nature will beat out Athenema's in current state. So the better example would be swapping this up to the Lee Sin and swapping this up to LeBlanc. LeBlanc will never proc your Force of Nature. It will never happen. She does not hit you multiple times. Leona could potentially proc it, but by that point in time, LeBlanc's also nuking you, and she will nuke you. Then partway through her combo, Force of Nature will be procced. So Athenema's becomes the better option to be able to deal with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, now, off of that, that is the then applying numbers to thematics. And with this, again, you're going to have to be able to learn the math of the items in and of itself, but for the most part, thematics will overrule the numbers. And this goes for all champions and all roles. The couple exceptions are, is an item broken? So for AD carries in current state, for instance, Shield Bow is by far the best option. Thematically, Gale Force makes sense in some cases, Kraken Slayer makes sense in some cases, Shield Bow makes sense in some cases. You still have the option to run all 3. It's not like the other 2 are bad items. It's just Shield Bow is so strong, they have to make a really good argument for the other items. So like for instance, Jinx can take Kraken Slayer and cut through tanks. And also get one-shot and die. Or you take Shield Bow and over the course of a fight, because you're alive, you out-damage Kraken Slayer. Why would you build Kraken Slayer then? You have to make a really, really good argument to justify it at that point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So now we're going to apply thematic or numbers to the thematics of champions in and of themselves. So, there's a couple different classifications of champions. Let me type this out real quick. So, we're going to look towards bruisers, long range. I'm going to put caster. Burst caster.
Thanks.
Tank, thank you. ADC. Control mage. Assassin. This should be good enough. There are a couple others, but for the most part, this is generally what we're looking at. So, mathematically, thematically with bruisers, what do they have? What is so special about them numerically that classifies them as bruisers?
It's those early game stats.
Mhm.
Because then they can kind of just stat check the shit out of you if they get a lead.
Cool.
But naturally speaking, they will fall off in the later portions of the game.
Mhm. Explain that to me numerically. What
Uh,
exact value is high? What exact value is low? How and why? Because we just established they are very level dependent. They're very level
right.
dependent. What causes them to be very level dependent? What's the reasoning behind that numerically?
Come to think of it, I've never actually thought of the numerical reason why that was. It was always just kind of a ration thing that was explained to me once, and I was like, oh, I get it now.
Because we have to understand this to go into the next section, which is why lanes are the way they are.
Mm.
So let's think about it this way. When you level up, what do you get? Think more broad sense. You don't have to give me exact, like, all the stats.
When you level up,
Mhm.
you get more AD, more armor, more health.
Okay, I'll cut you off there. Those are base stats. So that's the overarching one. So we don't have to go over all the stats of like the health regen, mana regen. Cluster all of those into base stats. What else do you get? There's one other thing. How often do you press Control Q?
Oh, you're getting more levels on your abilities.
Yeah. So if we're ignoring items because we're level dependent, what does that mean for our base numbers?
Means that they are hitting harder. Your abilities are going to be hitting harder.
Okay. Yeah. So the base numbers on the abilities are higher. So for instance, if you rank up Jace's Q, it goes up by like 55. You rank up Jinx's Q, she gains 10% attack speed. Yay! Very, very stark difference in that, right? So also with those
Right.
base stats we were talking about, if we're level dependent, what does that mean for the base stats?
If you're level dependent for the base stats, that would mean that. Does it mean that your base stats would be high?
Yeah. You get very high base stats per level. Yes. You're very, very experience based if that's the case, because you require those levels to be able to get those massive stat ups. So, for instance, this is something I talk about a lot with resistances in particular, right? Ranged characters in the game have 0.5 MR scaling per level. Melees have 1.25 to 2. Ranged characters generally get about 2 to 2.5 armor per level. Melee characters get 3 to 4.5. So generally by the time you're at your second item, melee characters generally have around like 60 to 70 armor. It's actually really high. So if you're building lethality versus a bunch of melees and only lethality and never touching percent pen, melees don't actually have to build armor versus you. They don't care. You have to have percent pen to deal with them because they have melee stats. Melee based stats are different from range based stats. Tank stats are different from bruiser stats, which are different from melee assassin stats. All of them are slightly different, but all of them will be higher than ranged if they're melee. And bruisers are in that middle ground, lower than tanks, higher than AD or higher than melee assassins. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. So they are very level dependent in that regard, right? They also have, if they're level dependent and not item dependent, stop trying to offer me to buy views. I don't want to buy views. Just give me the views.
But for the low, low price of buying your views, you can have more views.
Where's the band? There it is. I'm mod views, so I forgot the band. Okay. So, if they care about levels over top of items by a long shot, again, this is why bruisers generally go for like, oh, this item has a little bit of AD, but a lot of life. This item has some AD, but a lot of resistances. Bruisers want those kind of items. Why?
Uh, That is a really good question because I mean, for the most part, I've always thought that you'd want your stats to be dispersed throughout different portions because a bruiser is supposed to kind of have that mid ground of being both tanky but also decent damage.
Mhm. And
So
that's where
why
the Y
would you
comes
want
in.
to, yeah, why
Mhm.
would you want to lean into a specific stat more so than like this item would be able to give me uh high amounts of armor and health. Like
Yeah, why wouldn't a bruiser build a pure tank item? They're
it
still
would be
melee
more
because they're gold.
depend it would be dependent on the matchup then, yeah? Like you'd want that armor and health because you're going into a melee matchup.
Let's think about it this way. If Volibear goes Sunfire Cape into Ronduin's into Frozen Heart, he'll be super tanky. What's his damage output like?
Not very good.
So if Volibear goes Triforce or Divine Sunder into Sterix Gauge into then tank, his damage output's going to be pretty relevant.
Yeah.
Why does that little bit of AD make a difference?
Well, the little amount of AD makes a difference because they do a lot better with those stats. And then
Why?
leaning,
You haven't answered the why yet.
isn't it because of their scaling?
Okay,
Not
what scaling in particular? They do
their
have a very
damage.
specific scaling.
Their
They have what type of scaling?
good. I'm blanking here.
If you don't know, that's okay.
I think we're in that position where once I hear it, I'm going to be mad. But go ahead.
Okay. They have moderate to high total AD scaling.
I hate this.
So when they get levels, their base AD goes up and they have high base AD. Because their ability scale off of total AD, their damage goes up by quite a significant margin. When they build things that just have raw AD, they don't require pen, they don't require all this stuff. They just require things that say, increase my AD by X amount. And the X amount doesn't have to be very high. It doesn't have to be like Yumu's levels high, because they have like 140% total AD. So if something gives them, I'm going to make the math easier here. Let's say 150% total AD scaling, right? If something gives them 50 AD, that increases that ability damage by 75. The Bruiser already has high base values, right? We already established that. Per level, they get a high value. So if you're getting a high value off of that, you don't need much more damage to be able to cause kill threat. So that little bit puts them over the threshold to be able to cause the kill. And remember how we talked about that game theory right at the beginning? Of you need just enough damage to kill someone? Welcome to Bruiserland. There's the concept. So, that is the concept as to why bruisers are bruisers. You take away one of these two things, they suck. You take away Renekton's total AD scaling and swap it to bonus AD, he now has to go full assassin. He has to have really high AD values. If he has really high AD values, well then he's just a squishy person. If he's a squishy person, he's just going to die on repeat. It's not going to do anything. So he's just screwed. So he has to justify building those bruiser type items. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And that is why they are the way they are. So, long range caster. What do they have? The first one's going to be real obvious.
They have a long range.
Yep. Generally, high range consists of like 1,000 plus. Mid-range mages are generally like around 900, 800, around that area. And then short-range casters are closer to like the 600, 700 category. So first off, yeah, they have really high range, right? What else do they have?
More often than not, they have pretty decent AP scaling. Like they do pretty damn good damage.
Okay, I'm going to put higher damage. And what type of damage? We already talked about it earlier. This type of damage right here.
Higher burst damage.
Yeah. Why are they burst?
Typically because most of the high range abilities are kind of just like you're either charging them up for longer or they have a higher like wind up time. so that when they do hit their targets because of the difficulty of kind of landing those skill shots more often than not, it's supposed to be hitting like a truck.
Yes and no. You've touched on a
Okay.
game design concept of the harder an ability is to hit, the higher damage output it's going to be. So naturally, skill shots are going to be higher damage output than point and click. That's just how game design works. When you don't have that, you have Rise from 4 seasons ago one-shotting people with only point and click abilities while being a full tank. That was a problem. Well, so let's think about it, right? How can you have DPS when you're forced to use abilities to be able to deal damage output? There's an actual answer to this question. Think about it. What mages are DPS mages?
I mean, Malzahar for the most part. He'll just kind of hit you with something and you'll burn for a pretty long time. Brand.
He's control mage.
And Brand is also a control mage.
Yeah, Brand is half burst, half... He's weird.
Right.
He's not a pure
then,
DPS.
Yeah, and then you got Zyra, who's also... like
Zyra's poke counter engage. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
There's a couple easier ones. We talked about one earlier. Cassiopeia.
Oh, yeah.
Where she looks at you and says, if you're a tank, I'm going to nuke you the fuck down. I have enough DPS to say I'm going to take you down. I am all DPS. You look at Azir. Azir is all DPS plus his ultimate. All consistent damage output, right? Brand is burst and then burn. A little bit of burn. Zyra is burst and then a little bit of burn. Malzahar is control mage. He never bursts, and he's more of a DPS one, so I'll give you that one. So then, if those characters are still mages, they still have okay range, they're more mid-rangey, why aren't they burst characters?
Because their damage comes from them being able to use their abilities over and over and over again.
Yes, so burst mages or burst characters generally have what with their abilities?
Higher cooldowns.
High cooldown, and if something does 3 damage and it has a 30-second cooldown, will you ever use it?
No.
Something has 4,000 damage on a 30-second cooldown, will you ever use it?
Hell yeah.
So it requires high cooldowns and high damage output. That is what creates the high burst. So long-range casters will generally have that. What happens if a long-range caster has shit on too short of a cooldown?
They become a pretty big problem.
When's the last time you faced a late-game Ziggs?
I see where you're going now.
4-second minefield cooldown, 2-second bomb cooldown, 35-second ult cooldown. We've now run into a problem. It takes them a while to get there, and that's why Ziggs is a hyper carry. Compare that to Xerath. Compare that to Zoe in current state. Not released Zoe. Compare that to Jace, where his main burst is an 8-second cooldown because he requires gate, right? All of those champions are long-range casters, and the high burst comes from longer cooldowns with very high damage output. When you get into pure poke is more consistent, generally. So that's where you're looking at like the Ziggs type thing. So that's what long-range casters have, right? And when you look at their base stats, what kind of base stats do they have?
They got pretty crappy ones, yeah?
Yeah. Because why would we allow something who is already outranging everyone to have high base damages so they don't need items? That's just, they're already oppressing you. Now they oppress you more by existing. Fuck.
Right.
Now we make them tanky because high base stats, like high health values, high armor values, well, now we can't kill them. Crap, we're screwed. So they have to have low base stats to be able to compensate. So long-range casters, poke shit, generally cares about itemization over top of levels. Levels are still nice to them because they still have longer cooldowns. They want the cooldown reduction for their abilities per level. But for the most part, they care about items. So now we get to burst casters, which are just short-range, long-range casters. So here's the fun part, right? Clearly they have high burst. We already established this, right?
Yeah.
Now because they're shorter range, what changes about them compared to long-range casters? Ignore the range part. We already know the range part.
Right. Isn't it that The thing with burst is that their damage is even higher.
Oh, yeah.
So
Because melee things have higher damage output than long range things naturally because game design.
right,
Long range things have the advantage of I'm going to hit you without you touching me. So if I hit just as hard as the melee thing, I'm broken.
right.
So they will have high. I'm going to put high burst and higher burst. I have these in the wrong spots. Fixed. Oh, it's doing the thing again. There we go. Okay. I don't know what's doing that. Oh, well. Yeah, so burst casters have higher burst than long range casters, right? And there's one other main thing. So let's put into perspective Silas numbers versus like Zareth numbers. They're both casters. They're both burst casters. One has longer range, one's shorter range.
Yep.
What's different about them?
I'd say that the difference is that the Silas is going to be almost bruisery in his like in his
Say it. You got this.
god damn it, in his stats.
Yeah!
So his base stats are going to be significantly better.
Yeah, if you look at Lucian right now, if you go on the wiki, he has bruiser base stats because he's so short range.
Right.
Yeah! They have really high base stats, and because of this as well, they have shorter cooldowns as well, because if you're going to be in the fray, you need multiple rotations off because you are there. You are stuck there. It's happening.
Right. So would a champion like Echo, would he fall under the category of a burst caster or an assassin, or is he both?
Both.
Okay.
Mostly assassin. But yes, he does have short cooldowns. He does have high base stats because he is a melee, and he does have very high burst. He fits this perfectly. Burst caster is just a more broad one because that also includes like Misfortune, Lucian, Jace, Vhagar, things like that. It's a more in general one comparatively. Because there are just pure assassins, so that's why I have it on the list. So, let's go over tank real quick and assassin, and we'll skip the ADC control mage, because you can just touch on this real quick. ADCs, really low base stats, really low scaling per level. They need items. Give them gold. Think about why AD carries only feel relevant at like 2 to 3 items based on how good they are. And the 2 item AD carries are, hey, guess what? Burst casters. Not actual real AD carries. Control mages are high range, very, very high CC, lower damage, lower base stats. They're ones that say you're not allowed to walk through this area. Think Orianna. Orianna does pitiful damage in most metas until she hits 3 items. Then she starts hurting, but that entire time you still can't walk next to her ball. From level 6 plus, you walk next to her ball, she's ulting you, you've now run into a problem. Make sense?
Yes.
Alright, let's touch on tanks real quick. What do they have?
They got big health.
Okay, what's health?
Health?
Hmm?
I,
What else they got?
survivability. They got armor. They got health.
Right, what are all those called?
Survivability. Oh, stats.
Stats! Because anyone can build tank. Any character in the entire game can build it. Just like any character in the game can build crit. You can play Crittlesticks. Why is Crittlesticks bad? He has horrendous attack speed. Absolutely horrendous attack speed. He has bad base stats for it. So, tanks have the highest base stats in the entire game. Hands down. They are the highest. They care the most about levels for getting tanky. But, why don't tanks deal damage then?
Because they don't have nearly as good scaling in regards to their damage.
They have no scaling on abilities. It's basically irrelevant, or else you'd see AP tanks. And they also have no what on their abilities. Or, let me rephrase this. And low. Low what on their abilities.
Cooldowns?
Nope.
No.
Why don't they hurt? Why don't they hurt when they get levels? Why doesn't Maokai just instantaneously kill an AD carry with just tank items?
Because he's got low damage scaling, yeah?
Yeah. low scaling abilities. By the way, scaling on abilities is the itemization portion of it. Like total AD, total AP, bonus AD, all of that. That is what is classified as scaling.
Got it.
So the other one is base damage on abilities.
Got it.
So tanks are lower base damage. Generally, they have one ability that hits relatively hard. So Ornn has W, Sion has Q. Sion's kind of a special case. Maokai has his Q, right? If a tank is balanced correctly, they have like one main damage ability to say, all right, we can get through laning phase. And then all the other stuff is just kind of utility and meh kind of stuff. But when you look at tanks that are relevant, generally they're going to be the ones that hit the hardest while still having CC. So like Ornn has Brittle. He has his W. That's really, really high damage output. Sion has his ultimate and has his Q. Those are both really high damage output. They're exceptions to the rule. But when a tank is done correctly, they shouldn't be killing people. They should just be setting up people. And they should have enough damage to say, okay, if you make a misplay, I will eventually deal with you. I can't deal absolutely zero damage, or else why not play a bruiser? That kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Alright.
Because the only thing that I'm kind of conflicted with, right, is that they have no scaling on abilities and low base damage on abilities. However, like, why is it that if I built full AP on something like Malphite, I can just still one-shot shit, right?
They've actually nerfed that multiple times, and you're not supposed to be able to. So let's pull this up real quick. And let's compare it to pick any mage in the entire game. Don't care.
Teemo.
Sure. Teemo's going to be a bad example, but we'll go with it anyways, just for simplicity's sake. So let's pull that up. Let's pull up this. All right. So, League. Let's look at the scaling on abilities, right? So looking at Malphite. So to start with, his Q is 60 AP, and this is his one that actually scales damage output-wise. This is his ability to get him through laning phase, for all intents and purposes. You can choose the other two abilities to get you through laning phase, but this is the one designed to do it, right? So it's a 60% AP value. His W is a 20% AP value. His E is a 60% AP value. His ultimate used to be 100, now it's 80. Collectively in a combo, he deals 60 plus the 60, so 120 AP. This is 200% AP. Then situationally based on how much he smacks. So let's assume 2 auto attacks before people start to be like, oh, hey, let's move. Because if you're building full AP, you don't get to sit in the middle of a fight. It's not an option. So this deals 240% AP in a full combo. Right? If we look at Teemo at just a base value, his Q hits as hard as your ultimate. Teemo's one auto attack is 30%, so it's even higher than Malphite's. A singular mushroom is 50% AP. This is kind of where he's a bad example. But even the bad example, his Q deals as much as Malphite ultimate. It's the same damage. The reason Teemo's a bad example is he is what? What's his thematic? He has 2.
That's a great question. I've never really thought of him thematically speaking. Like, where does he fit in? Because, like, his ult is just laying down mushrooms. So
yep, what does that do?
He's kind of control.
Yeah, he is zone control. That is one thematic. If he places all these around a dragon or a baron, the opponents can't walk in. The other thematic involves this thing right here.
So DPS?
He's an auto attacker.
Oh.
Most of his damage comes from auto attacks. So if that's the case, why would he have very high AP values? Because he's played from multiple auto attacks. That's why he's a bad example. So let's swap it up to another mage. Let's go Syndra. Syndra's the standard of the standard. And let's look at the damage differential. So Syndra's Q is 65, or at level 9, very realistic to come in the game very easily, it's 81. Syndra's Q does 2/3 of Malphite ultimate. Syndra's W is your Q as Malphite. This base value is 65 higher than Malphite E. Now we touch on Syndra ultimate. See the damage differential?
Yes.
So when Malphite goes full AP, if any target builds any form of magic resist, he's useless. He doesn't have enough damage to kill him anymore. Even if he builds Pen, it's not going to happen. So Malphite can only go AP versus incredibly squishy teams that do not have the capability to build magic resist, and he has to be sole AP. If he is not sole AP, then people will find ways to fit magic resist into their build because they're too valuable. Mages will pick up Banshee's Veil. AD carries will pick up Wit's End. Bruisers will pick up either Brazen Dying, Force of Nature, or the other one, Spirit Visage. And then all of a sudden, Malphite is just worthless. He doesn't do enough damage to be relevant. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Then on top of that, again, keep in mind, this is a melee. So if a melee goes into the middle of a fight and is pure squish, they better kill their target or they're worthless. But we already established he doesn't do enough damage to justify that playstyle a lot of the time. There are some times where it can come out. Very situationally. And you're literally picking him to say, my ultimate is a kill. But also in competitive play, you can just ult and then someone else can kill the target for you. Or we go back to that thematic concept of you just need enough damage. If you have a full tank Malphite versus a full squishy team, you can kill a squishy just over the course of a little bit of time. You don't need to build AP. It's not required. So even if you do build AP Malphite, generally it's pseudo AP Malphite. Very, very rare. Is it like full AP Malphite, like the Proto Belt and all of that, or like Ludens? Generally, that's troll above all else. No AP go bad. Okay. But yeah, that's why Malphite can't play AP. It just doesn't work. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So, last one we're going to do real quick is Assassin. What do Assassins have, stat-wise?
Stat-wise, they have... I'm pretty sure they have okay stats to start. Like, moderate.
Oops.
Yep. However, they do really high burst damage.
Cool. Why?
Because they scale harder.
What scaling?
Their attack damage.
Okay, so they have high attack damage scaling. What type of attack damage scaling? There's only two options. Total or bonus?
Wouldn't it be bonus?
Yeah. Oop. So this is incredibly valuable because if someone has incredibly high bonus AD scaling and they level up, does that impact their damage of their abilities? For base stat wise. If their AD goes up by 3 per level, does that impact their abilities?
Not enough.
Not at all. Because every time you level up, remember, that's a base stat. That's your base AD going up, not your bonus AD. Leveling AD is completely irrelevant to Assassins. It does nothing. It increases their auto attack damage, but generally, you're not auto attacking a target. You're killing them with your abilities. So, Assassins require building heavy AD in their items because that's the only way they get damage to their abilities. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's why if you suffocate out a Talon or a Kiana or a Zed or anything like that, and they're at one item while you're at like 2 to 3, they just don't hurt you. They don't do anything. Because they require items. They need it. So when that Katarina makes its third roam down bot lane and gets literally nothing and is down 50 farm, awesome. Its ultimate is dealing literally 30 damage a dagger. Why do we care? It's not going to do anything. But yeah, overarching, this is conceptually what champions do because there's always a why as to what classification they are. It's not just magically they are bruisers. It's not just magically they are tanks. It's not just magically they're assassins. Numerically, there's a method behind the madness. And when something breaks this method, so there's enough bonus AD on bruiser items for assassins to take it and still kill someone, you run into an issue. And it needs to be fixed very quickly. That's why assassins could run Gore Drinker. They still had enough damage to kill because Gore Drinker had way too much AD in it. That's why the thing that they nerfed on it was they took away the 0 to 15% bonus AD. And that's when assassins stopped building it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. So, now, off of that, we get to look at League's meta and why lanes are the way they are. So, actually, let me undo that. I don't know why I deleted that. That's actually important. So, when we're looking at this, right, and now we're thinking about why the lanes are the way they are, It's because of the thematics of the champion and what they want to accomplish. So bruisers, for instance, are very level dependent. So what happens if we put a bruiser in a duo lane and they share XP?
Then the bruiser's going to fall behind really hard because he needs those levels.
Exactly. They're going to be completely worthless. What happens if we throw a pure real tank, like Ornn, for instance, into the support role?
He's gonna do pretty okay, like super early. But he's gonna be unable to really keep up.
Yeah, absolutely, because he has very high base stats. He requires levels, right? If he doesn't get those levels, he's screwed. So when he's in a duo lane, he's also screwed. So that's why also supports that get played are the ones that have incredibly high utility to the point where they don't care. They have 0 damage output regardless of what level they are, and their utility's basically the same regardless of what level they are. Leona will still stun lock a target and deal basically the same damage. Blitzcrank will still hook a target and still do virtually the same thing, right? That kind of stuff. So, we can now establish in bot lane, we are not allowed to play anything in the carry role that requires levels. We in the support role are not allowed to play anything that requires gold or levels. Does that make sense?
Yes.
When you look towards mid lane, actually, I think I'm describing this wrong. I think I'm going to start with something else before we progress further on this, and it's going to make a lot more sense. I have a better way to do this. So, completely changing thought process. Do you know how each lane wins the game? Like what they do individually to win the game?
Say one more time. I'm very sorry.
Sure. Do you know how each lane wins the game? So like what top lane, if it gets ahead, what does that do to help win the game? If mid lane gets ahead, what does that do to help win the game? So on and so forth.
If top lane is winning its lane, then it has a couple options. Either it's going to be using its strength to influence the game by forcing more than one person to come to its lane, or it's going to take its lead to other lanes and help them get ahead or TP onto objectives to help turn team fights and try and use that lead to the best of their ability to push forward the rest of its teammates.
Okay. You have partially the correct concept, right? So first off, when you get a lead and someone's coming to bail out the opponent, awesome. Yes, you drew more attention to yourself. Any lane can do that. That's not top exclusive.
Right.
For top lane rotating around the map to be able to help their team, how? They're always on the other side of the map from the objective. So it has to be from TP, right? So they can do that once every 6 minutes.
Right.
That's not rotating around the map.
Right.
That's utilizing TP. That's a completely separate matter, right? And then you brought up utilizing TP, so then that fits into that category, right? So let's think about that for a second. We will always be on the opposite side of the map from the objective because someone has to, naturally, right? And if we're always on the opposite side of the map, that also means an opponent must always be on the opposite side of the map. So if you get massively ahead, what happens?
They have to send more than one person to deal with you. Otherwise, you just split push them into oblivion.
Yeah. They're forced to send more resources out after you because you decimated an individual target. When you destroy your opponent in top lane, you make the game a 4v5. That is what occurs. Because when someone has to come respond to you, similar concept, like, again, that's every lane's concept. But because you're on the opposite side of the objective, someone coming towards you is valuable. Someone coming towards the objective to fix a problem is not valuable. They're going to be there regardless. So because you've made the game a 4v5, we're assuming that player doesn't exist. So when you're on the opposite side of the map, someone has to come match you, and it can't be that person you were just destroying. It's not an option in that matter. That's how top lane wins. They make the game a 4v5. All right. So, off of that now, when we're thinking about that's how we make the game, or we make the game a 4v5, we have to be able to destroy the opponent, right? If we don't destroy the opponent, then we start running into a little bit of an issue of, okay, then What are they doing about this, right? On top of that as well, what happens if we get destroyed? Well, then we're screwed, right? So let's think about this. Top lane is very much determined by junglers because they can come up and it's an isolated environment. You're on the opposite side of the objective. No one's coming to help you. Mid lane shows up sometimes. Support shows up sometimes in the highest of elos. But for the most part, you're on an island. You are alone. Your job is to destroy that opponent as much as possible. If you fall behind, the opponent can freeze on you. The opponent can dive you. The opponent can completely screw you over, right? So if you are not allowed to touch the wave, you are getting 0 gold, right?
Right.
If you are getting 0 gold, that means generally up top lane, you cannot play something that requires gold. Because if you get destroyed in any way, shape, or form, one early gank, something to set you behind, you now get froze on, you get pushed off the wave, you get 0 gold. So you can only pick something that requires gold whenever you are counter-picking for it. So for instance, there's an Ornn in existence, you pick a Vayne. Vayne needs gold. Vayne's going to get the gold versus that Ornn. Doesn't matter how ahead the Ornn gets, that Vayne is going to get that gold eventually. There's nothing the Ornn can do about it. Right?
Right.
So if that's the case, we want to generally pick champions in that role that care about experience over items. Which roles care about experience over items?
That's going to be tanks, bruisers for the most part.
Yeah, you're right. That's the 2 categories. You're looking at tanks and bruisers. You can pick other things as hard counter picks that guarantee that like, you're still going to get the gold because it's a hard counter pick. But for the most part, you're looking at tanks and bruisers. There's one additional factor, right? If you're on the opposite side of the map from the objective, because someone has to be, and you TP into the middle of a fight, what's the value of a Vayne TPing into the middle of a fight?
There isn't really any.
It killed itself! Right.
Yep.
Now compare that to a bruiser TPs in to the middle of a fight. That's much more valuable. What happens if a bruiser TP flanks compared to a Vayne? Much more valuable. What happens if you brought up TPing for lanes and whatnot? What happens if a bruiser TPs into a level 3 fight? It's a vast difference. Very, very vast difference. Whenever you pick a thing that requires gold up top lane, you fucked your other side of the map because the opponent can just pick something with utility and say, I'm just going to TP down there. I will always have relevancy. All I care about is experience. I don't care about items. They don't matter to me. Then from there as well, your opponent will always have better TPs. Your opponent will always be able to get the experience. They will always be able to still function. And no matter how far behind they fall, because they only care about base stats, if they're 2 levels behind you, so fucking what? Their base levels are more valuable than yours. They're happy with that. If a Malphite is 0-10, it will still press R and still be relevant. So you're allowed to pick stuff up top that can get absolutely destroyed, and it doesn't matter. The only times when it does matter is when a counter pick is so volatile that you're out of the game. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. So that's how top lane wins. We'll also touch on who goes in what role here in a second as well, based on map state. That is also a vastly different thing. Because clearly, if we have a dual lane, we have a mid lane, and we have a solo lane, why is it that way? That'll make sense here in a second as well. So junglers, how do they win the map? How do they win the game when they get ahead?
They win the game by getting their... They win the game by getting their laners ahead. They win the game by being able to have control over objectives and being able to control their side of the map as well as possibly getting into the other side of the map.
Yep. And one thing you didn't touch on overarching there was when they do get ahead, they basically guarantee wherever they are is a strong point. Because they're the ones that move around the map constantly. So if they're bot lane, all of a sudden bot lane is a strong point. They're top lane's now a strong point. Doesn't really matter what champion they are when they get that big or when they get bigger. That is now a strong point. It just exists there. Which is fantastic for being able to force plays, right? So off of that, right, we have to think about now what kind of kind of things can play jungle. And here's the fun part. It's anything that can clear. Anything. Because think about this, right? Well, let me rephrase this. It's anything that can clear and works off of the economy of a jungle. Let me phrase it that way. So do you know what the economy of a jungle is? Generalization.
It's Camps.
Yeah, value-wise. Value-wise. Think about it in terms of other laners. That's the easiest way to describe it. So are they higher or lower in XP and gold than a mid laner?
Oh, they're lower.
All right. Are they higher or lower than in XP than a bot laner?
Higher.
Yeah. That's kind of their neutral point. They'll be a level lower than solo lanes. They'll be a level above bot laners, generally. Then they'll have more gold. Or sorry. They will have less gold than laners, less gold than the AD carry, more gold than the support. And it's not by a lot. It's by a little bit. They work off of a smaller economy than all other roles. So, if that's the case, you have to pick something that has the ability to clear, works off of that economy, and then when it gets accelerated, it does actually provide a point of power. Because what happens if we're playing Ziggs jungle and we get 3 kills really early on? Cool, you're still playing Ziggs jungle. It still dies to everything. It still needs a very heavy economy. You are not strong if you show up bot lane. The opposing Xin Zhao being 0-3 is still more relevant than you. You don't do anything. But, as long as it fits into that classification, anything can be picked given a correct circumstance. So one of the fun ones that we've run in Varsity for a while is Jungle Mordekaiser. When he goes up against a bunch of melees, he can work off of an economy. Slightly lower than a solo laner, so he's still worse than as if he's in a solo lane. But no melees can deal with him as a champion. And he clears so quickly that he stays very relevant in the game. It's one of those weird things that absolutely functions given the correct circumstance, right?
Right.
Because you can take the standard stuff of like, okay, I can look at Xin Zhao, I can look at Viego. They have average clears, high dueling, good early game, good mid game, functional late game. All that works. But they're generalized. You don't have to be generalized in the jungle or in any of these roles. As long as it fits the classification of what's required, fits your thematic of composition, and beats the opposing thematic, it works. Great example of that. Cho'Gath is a 4-way flex. He goes top, he goes jungle, he goes mid, and he goes AD carry with support fasting Senna. He fits everything. As long as he fits the thematic, put him wherever you want. Doesn't matter. He can work off of an economy. He can work off of having a high economy. He can work off of having no levels because all he cares about is level 11. It works. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right, so we're looking at mid lane. How does mid lane win the game?
Now, with mid lane, it's a bit different because then they can definitely roam significantly more.
That's
than
it. You found it.
top
Done.
lane could.
That's it. That's how mid lane wins. When they get a lead, they just start roaming to other lanes to get other people ahead. They play around their jungler. They play around other lanes. Why can't they play around themselves?
Because they don't really get anything out of that. Isn't it because they kind of will just repeatedly shove under a turret and then sit there and do nothing?
Why? Why can't they shove the wave and hit turret?
Because if they do, they'll get ganked immediately.
Why?
Because they're pushed up too far in their lane and it's very exposed because it's in the middle of the map and they're right there.
There it is. Yes! Junglers clear 2 camps and they path by mid. They clear 2 camps, path by mid. Support leaves lane, guess where they're going? Mid lane. Mid lane is the most volatile spot in the entire game. And it's the one that determines the entire pace of the game. Because if you have no mid prio, how does your jungler function? If your jungler can't function, how do any lanes function? Because they're not getting any ganks from mid or jungle. Everything gets screwed. So, if that's the case, think about what type of champions get played mid lane. A lot of the time, it's mages. Why? What do mages have that fits that play style?
They have a pretty long range.
Mm-hmm. And with their abilities, they do what?
They do burst damage.
Okay. Think about it in a more general sense, because we're not trying to beat the opponent. We're trying to beat the other lanes. Why do mages get to do that better than other roles? Why don't we throw... That's a good example. Why don't we throw Misfortune mid?
Isn't it because I don't think I got the answer for this one.
Okay. Very, very high and safe wave clear. If your job is to roam, how do you roam if the wave is pushed under your turret?
Right.
So if Misfortune has to walk up closer to the wave than the mage to clear it, and clears it slower, she is now less safe and does her job worse than any of those other mages. Doesn't function. So if you're going to play something mid, it has to be able to wave clear. Or it has to have so much scaling that you can justify the pick. Kassadin. If you throw Kassadin top and he gets froze on, he needs items. And he needs levels. He can't afford to be frozen. And mid lane can get so much help that you can run the Kassadin and kind of fit that thematic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because let's think about the other thing that gets played mid a lot besides mages. Zed, Talon, Kiana. What do?
Assassins.
They literally just fuck off to another lane and kill someone.
Yep. High burst damage. They just kind of zoom.
And they ignore the wave. They let the wave crash on their turret while they're going to make a roam.
Yep.
That is the thematic of mid lane. That is why those champions get run there. Just like with bruisers and tanks up top, they want to TP into the middle of fights. They want to be able to have an impact on that, and they also only care about levels. Mid lane cares about wave clear very, very drastically and cares about roams very, very heavily because they're in the middle of the map. They have the ability to roam. They have the ability to do these things. That's also why you don't see assassins top, because where the fuck do they roam to? Oh, hey, top's missing. Oh, they're running mid, aren't they? Yeah. Repeat process. Was it due? No one cares. No one should die to that, ever. Right. So with that, we can now look into the bot lane, right? And with bot lane, what does their economy look like?
They are typically looking fairly low on gold until like mid to late game.
Why does an AD carry have less gold than a mid laner? Explain that to me.
Because they aren't going to be able to roam as much. They're not getting as many kills as fast.
We're assuming common sense applies. If a mid laner rotates, people just back off. If we assume that people get accelerated, then we can say that for any role. So that can't be a valid argument for any of this. So if mid laners are roaming, basically it's forcing someone off the wave. So unless we get into very, very specific things, we have to assume net neutrality. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So under that context, why does an AD carry have less gold than a mid laner? Because the answer, by the way, is mid laners have less gold than AD carry by a slight amount.
Oh. Huh.
It's for a very obscure reason, too, by the way.
Then I would have no idea.
Yep. If an AD carry has 100 farm and a mid laner has 100 farm, they both have 100 farm. Gold has not changed. The only reason a mid laner has less farm than top and AD carry by a slight amount is because they reduce the gold value of cannon minions in mid lane. They're actually worth less. It's by a small amount, but it's not really that relevant. Just a more minor thing. But if they both have 100 farm, they're going to be very, very close in gold to each other.
My question to you is, and it doesn't have to be like a really long explanation if there is just a simple answer, but why would they make it so that a mid lane's cannon is worth less than top or bots?
That's okay. This is actually a quick answer. They were going to also implement a change where they desynced mid-wave spawn from the other side lanes to prevent perma-roams, because right now mid lane just perma-roams. And they ended up just going with reducing the gold on cannon minions. It was one of two changes.
Well, that's a very bad idea then, because they didn't follow through with the other part.
Yes, I agree with that. It was basically kind of like, for all intents and purposes, it's less incentive to stay in lane, because now if you miss a cannon, it's worth less.
Right.
So it did the opposite of what was required. It was a dumb change.
So wouldn't they want to
up the value of the gold a bit? Yes.
Yeah, but even then though, then that kind of gives them that. Interesting.
Not a good change. So AD carries have the same gold value as other laners. Here's the fun part: they're safer at getting it. Why?
Say one more time that question.
AD carries are safer than all other roles getting farm. Why?
Because they have a support right behind them, right?
Yeah, they never have to rotate or do anything. On top of that, if mid lane rotates and misses a wave, AD carry doesn't have to rotate. Support rotates. AD carry sits there a lot of the time. Top laner TPs to a fight, he loses 2 to 3 waves. AD carry doesn't do that. He sits there and farms. He gets all of his gold. Problem with that, though, there's a second person in your lane a lot of the time. Up until you get to really high levels of play, there's a support there constantly. So
Right.
if that's the case, you can't rely on your levels for anything. When a mid laner is level 13, an AD carry is generally level 9. Support is generally level 7. So if that's the case, your abilities need to have near zero scaling to function. You can't rely on anything past level 13. So you get 2 of your abilities to max rank. But you can rely on items. So anything that's going to be played in the AD carry role, where there's a support with you, up until supports literally fuck off of lane permanently and are second junglers, which they're very close to doing right now, you can only play things that fit that category. If you play a bruiser bot, they will never function. If you play Caston bot, it will never function. If you play Malzahar bot, Malzahar is a mage that cares about the level of all of his abilities and cares about level 16 ultimate very heavily. He cannot be run bottom. He will never hit 16. Corki requires level 11 to function. 16 is when he becomes a monster. He can never be played bot lane either. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then we also kind of went over supports already of, well, supports don't get anything. So they're basically just pure utility. They have to be all utility. Nothing else. If they have anything besides utility, they're Pike or nothing. Well, Pike or Senna or nothing. They have to have some gimmick to let them stay in the game. And notice how both of the 2 champions with a gimmick, it's just a massively large quantity of gold. That's how they keep themselves going. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So now we're going to touch on why they are in the lanes that they are. So let's think about this, because this will also explain rotations very heavily. So here on my screen, I have Summoner's Rift. Let's see if I can zoom in. Hey, I can. Nice. All right. So off of this, right, we have to think about a couple things, right? So first off, we're going to start with objectives, right? So we have Dragon here. We have Rift Herald here. Rift Herald used to not exist, right? And this turns into Baron later, right? We have the red buffs and we have the blue buffs, but realistically, map's pretty mirrored, right? So let's think about this, right? We already established why mid lane is in mid lane, right? It's because they have to be able to rotate, right? So we have to have something with a high enough wave clear to justify that rotation, or enough oomph to be able, like in the later stages of the game, to say we are sacking our early game to cause that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's already an established fact. Awesome. Nice and easy. So then why the fuck is the top laner here and the bot laner is here when this lane is the same as this lane?
Isn't it because you want the majority of your team closer to the dragon because it spawns more frequently?
Yeah, this is why I brought up that Rift Herald used to not exist, along with it spawns at 8 minutes. So you want your bot lane to be bot because this is the first objective that spawns, so they're ready and easy. It's very easy to defend it, right? There's
Right,
also
and
another
then-
reason that bot lane is bot. Go ahead.
And then you got TP topside if you ever need them on it as
Right. So
well.
then you send whoever needs to be into the fight through TP up top. So the person who wants to be in the middle of the fight or flanking. A mage generally does not care about being in the middle of the fight. That's called suicide. The mage does not generally care about flanking because they can do their job from being in the team and safe. They can flank. They can do things with it. Don't get me wrong. A Syndra stun flank can be nasty. But if that TP gets spotted out, a Wukong doesn't care if it gets spotted out. A Set doesn't care. An Ornn doesn't care. They're going to do their job regardless with Flash. Syndra very heavily cares. Orianna very heavily cares, right? That kind of stuff. Because they can just be picked off instantly and turned on. Other champions and bruisers and tanks cannot. Right? So then, yeah, we want the top laner to be able to have the TP and be able to TP into the middle of fights or have flanks. And also, again, they have to care about experience. Because if they're going to be alone and they lose, they're going to get zoned off the wave. They're not going to touch the farm. They can only get experience. So then again, wants to be a bruiser or something that will just decimate the opponent straight up. We've also seen what happens when Jace falls behind. He's just dead weight. Never functions. He requires so much assistance to keep going and play on the front foot constantly. If he doesn't, he's just screwed. Eventually he'll scale up to a pokey thing, but if he falls behind, he's out of the game for a very long period of time. All right. So then with bot lane, we want them to be next to the objective. So let's think about that, right? What would have happened if Rift Herald spawned at 8 minutes and Dragon never existed? I forgot to touch on one thing, sorry. There's one other reason that bot laners are bot. Do you know what it is? It involves the turrets.
Actually, no, I do not.
Pre 5 minutes, mid and top turret take 50% reduced damage.
Oh.
From champions. It was literally, there used to be a meta where AD carries and supports would just determine which lane they went based on matchups and either go top or bot and just basically say, all right, if we have a bad matchup, we're going top and we're just going to say your top laner doesn't get to play the game. And we're just going to bum rush this turret down. And we're going to bum rush the next turret down up until you stop us. When you stop us, we're just going to rotate back. And then the other bot lane is like, all right, we're going to bum rush these turrets down. Because realistically, First Dragon didn't mean that much. So they prevented the swapping by adding that factor onto it of the reduced damage output.
Oh.
So if a top laner gets a massive advantage, kills the opponent, cool, they're not smacking turret, they're taking resets. If you send your bot lane up top and they just push in the opponent and zone the opponent off the wave, they'll never take a plate. It won't happen. If mid lane pushes in, they'll never take a plate. Go rotate somewhere. Go do something. Stab it. So that's also why bot lane is bot. So now let's think about that, right? Our bot lane realistically has the highest wave clear in the game because it's 2 people compared to 1. The wave can just kind of die, right? You can even have just 2 really bad wave clearers down bot. They're still going to be near the highest, right? On top of that, they are the safest. They care basically 0 about experience, and one of them doesn't care about anything at all. They're just going to rotate around, right? On top of that as well, your AD carry is going to be your best objective taker in the game. Why?
It's your highest DPS?
Absolutely. They are the best objective takers in the game as at DPS. There are other things that can like compare to it. So for instance, Cassiopeia, right? Cassiopeia can nuke objectives very, very easily. Turrets, not so much. Turrets, not so much, but for Dragon and Barons, very, very valuable. Right? Excuse me. So you always want to rotate them around to wherever you're going to be getting the objective. Because also, realistically, League is all about numbers advantage. Everything is about numbers advantage, however you can get it. Generally, that's through junglers saying, all right, I'm going to gang top. Mid lane saying, all right, I'm going to push this in and rotate. Now all of a sudden, it's 3v2 worst case scenario. Because if jungler's up here, top lane's up here, we have our mid jungle top. There it is. You can guarantee a 1 fight off that. Make sense?
Yes.
So if that's the case, right, and you always want to play around objectives, you always want your bot lane smacking an objective of some kind. And you always want them to be closest to whatever the objective is. I'm assuming you've seen the Rift Hero rotations in pro play.
Yes.
Okay. That happens whenever bot lane takes the dragon early, then resets, then goes up top, and then as Rift Herald spawns, now you have your bot lane here, you have your TP here, and your mid laner is still doing mid lane things.
Yep.
It's the same play as the dragon, just flipped. And that's going to happen past 5 minutes, so this turret is now vulnerable. It's the same thing, right? So now let's think about that in a better sense, right? What happens when this turret drops? Where does bot lane go? You have 2 options, and explain both options to me. Let's start with top lane. Why would they go top lane?
Why would bot rotate top?
Yeah.
So the reason would be because then they have a safer lane. They're not pushing past river.
Nope.
And no?
Nope. They're perfectly safe in mid lane. They're 2 people. They don't care. Because both answers are correct. They go mid sometimes, they go top sometimes. There's a rationale as to why. So let's think about that. With the thing we just talked about, right, we always want our AD carry, or whoever is playing the AD carry role, smacking an objective for all intents and purposes, right? The only time you don't want that is like Sona Tahm Kench, but that's so rare, we're not going to talk about that fully, right? So when they take this turret, there's now no objective to smack, so there's no reason for them to be in this lane, right? So they want to be adjacent to wherever the most important objective is, right? So if they're going top lane, what's the most important objective then?
Going to be Rift Herald or Baron.
Herald or Baron, yeah. Generally, it's going to be Herald if we're taking turret and then doing this rotation, right? If that's the case, Dragon must not be up then. Or you took your turret at like 9 minutes or something like that, and then Herald is still valuable. But that's why they would want to go top lane. You're putting them so that they have an objective to smack in lane, and they are nearest to the most important objective. So now what happens if this turret's down, and they go mid lane? What objective is the most valuable then?
Well, that would be towards the bottom pocket, so that would be Dragon.
Dragon is up and available. Yes. That is your rationale for the rotations, right? Now we have to think about where everyone else is rotating, right? And this is all game theory. This goes to literally every game in existence. This is not just a league concept. This is everything, right? So if we send our bot lane top, where's our mid laner going?
Our mid lane is going to stay mid?
Yeah, why? Think about it this way. We're now making plays up top lane, right?
Right.
If we're making plays up top, we want two things to happen. We want our mid lane to rotate and our TP to be on the opposite side of the map.
Uh-huh.
So what happens if we show a bruiser here versus their mage? How does the bruiser out wave clear the mage?
He doesn't.
He doesn't. So if we have our mage TP from here all the way up to top, it doesn't matter because their mid laner is already on rotation. So basically, we match their rotation with a TP. That fucking sucks.
Yeah.
Right? So then, we have to send our mid laner back mid because contesting the wave clear, and we send our top laner down bot. There is one exception to this rule. And it's all based on the thematics of the game and what needs to be applied. As long as our mid laner, whoever is in mid has the ability to push in and rotate, and bot lane has TP, we're happy. So what happens if we had top lane Jace? So this is now a Jace. This is a Syndra. They're pretty equal in wave clear, right?
Yes.
And then we had our mage down here with high wave clear who can just sit down here and be fucking happy versus whoever gets thrown in because he just wave clears. He doesn't care. If Jace has no TP and our mid laner has TP, this is now the better rotation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And all of it is purely based on the thematic. We can put a wealth of champions here and a wealth of matchups, but the thematic is still the same. That's what actually matters. The thematic. Then you just have to justify the numbers afterwards. It's the same as items. It's the same as draft. It's the same as champions. It's the same in all games. This is game design. And then from here, it's just figuring out, does it actually work? Because what happens if Jace doesn't contest Syndra's wave clear and is at least neutral with it so we have an equal rotation? Well, then you can't do this. That's it. That's all that is. Notice now how everything's fucking circling back to itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all based on what is the thematic of what we're trying to accomplish above all else. And everything circles back to exactly what we were talking about at the start. Of game design is fluid. It works between multiple different games. It is then about creating a thematic that functions in this regard and then applying numbers to that thematic. There you go. And everything has its place, right? And now, luckily for League, this has been established over the course of 11 years. So there's a lot of information on this stuff. It's not like just magically disappears. It's just like there's some, not Picasso, Einstein that was just like, oh, let's throw two people bot lane. That revelation already happened back in season 1 where people were like, let's move Ashe out of mid lane. This is a bad idea. So, a lot of this then just kind of exists. And now you can take that information, again, transition it into literally any game. It doesn't matter. You can do the same stuff in Smite. You can do the same stuff in Dota. It all still exists in the same facet. Just applies slightly different numbers. All right. So now, off of all of this, we can now take these concepts and apply them into isolated environments. So, first off, any questions on everything so far?
Seems to be pretty good.
Okay. Because this is a good time, because now we're about to get into micro stuff over top of macro stuff. So this swaps it up. The macro stuff is still relevant. It will still be applied to all of this. But this is just a different category of it. Because this is where we start working with, okay, now how do we transition this knowledge to either gaining the knowledge or transitioning to individuals that are not yourself? That's where this next part is going. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So now we need to apply these into isolated environments, right? Where we understand what each role wants to accomplish, right? Top lane wants to decimate the opponent or sit back and exist and have more relevancy than them. So opponent has Aatrox, we have Malphite. Malphite will do more in a team fight than Aatrox. That's just the reality. Aatrox will beat out the tank in lane. That's just the reality. Eventually the tank will outscale and be able to duel the Aatrox. You can outscale people. You can make sure that they don't have the ability to play the game. But it's all about recognizing that thematic and what you want to accomplish. So, let's create a thematic now. Let's say in top lane we want to decimate the opponent. Doesn't matter the matchup. Our job is to beat them. Right? It's not sit back and scale. It's to decimate them in some facet, right? Your job then as the coach is to find the best way in order to decimate them collectively, as a group. Nothing is ever done as an individual, ever. Right? So, with that thought process, we have to think about something. Either A, we have such a good matchup that nothing is ever relevant. So let's give a stupidly good matchup. Let's assume tie play here. What's a good
Boom.
Why can't I think of a good one? Okay, it's Jackson the Volibear. Easy. Let me zoom out a little bit. There we go. And we have the Jax, right? There is no world in which case Volibear can win this. It's literally not possible. Right? So, top lane's job is to completely destroy top lane at all costs. Right? In an isolated environment, Jax can do this to Volibear on his own. Right? He doesn't need assistance. So if that's the case, when would Jax need assistance? 2 reasons.
He either...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh. So he's either A, going to need it because he, messed up his wave state and needs help breaking it. Or he's just not playing the lane correctly.
All right. Right now, let's assume neutrality. Because if we assume mistakes, then we can assume mistakes on both sides, and it's not worth it. But yes, you are correct. If Jax screws up in some facet, then he requires assistance to bring himself back into the lane. Sorry. I should have said assuming neutrality at the start. That is my fault. You did give a correct response, though.
Because in all honesty, like without the neutrality there, with the neutrality there, I'm not actually particularly certain of the answer.
Okay. One is jungler mid ganks. If he's going to be playing on the front foot constantly, someone's going to come help the Volibear. Because either Jax is overextended or they need to break the freeze, right? So if they need to break the freeze and someone comes top to be able to prevent them from breaking the freeze, now Volibear is still just screwed, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The secondary reason is what happens if Jax is slow pushing a wave and Volibear is sitting underneath this turret, and then Volibear can survive underneath the turret and get XP. Jax can't prevent him from getting XP in isolated environment. Jax can just say, you will never fight me, and I will push you off of the wave. You'll still get XP, but I will push you off of the wave. He needs help to completely deny Volibear XP in a neutral state. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's where dives would come in. That's where even just the threat of a dive would come in, because if we're assuming perfect play, he should have a ward, he should know the dive is coming, he should be able to back off. But we have to give the threat of it to exist before Volibear will actually respect it and do something about it. That's how you can take the Volibear completely out of the game instead of Volibear being 0-0-0 down the 100 farm and still one-shots the AD carry. Now he doesn't one-shot the AD carry anymore. And AD carry is happy and thrilled with life. Sort of. They're still AD carry players.
Right.
Right. So, in a isolated world environment, there are different ways in order to create these different net results. And that was a similar concept, right? In an isolated world, now we're looking at the Volibear side, where Volibear is going to get destroyed by Jax. Jax is going to be able to freeze on the wave. He's going to require assistance to be able to do something about this, right? Or else the Volibear is just screwed. Because they picked... This is just an incredibly hard counter pick. It's impossible matchup for Volibear. So if that's the case, remember the thematic of the game environment, right? Where everybody has a role to play in the game. Everybody has a job to do. So in this isolated world, we're ignoring what's happening bot lane here for now. In this isolated world, both junglers want to path top at basically the same time. Both mid laners want to rotate top at basically the same time. Because they want to either prevent the dive, or do the dive, or they want to prevent the freeze from breaking, or break the freeze. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So even in the isolated world of how this kind of concept gets created, all you're doing is forcing a response out of the opponents at bad times. That is your entire purpose in life when you're in a winning matchup. So for instance, if your jungler is pathing top lane, you want to fight your opponent. The second your jungler has the ability to be top, you want to fight your opponent. And you want to force the opposing jungler to come up. And you want to take that 2v2 because you've already decimated your opponent, right?
Right.
You can cause that by either A, freezing, or B, setting up a dive and then executing on the dive. A response has been made, right? When a response has been made, if you repel that response, both opponents are now screwed instead of just one. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, this response can be done by anyone. The support can roam up, the mid laner can roam up, the jungler can come up, right? Any way to be able to prevent or do the response, that is the job of the entire team. It is not one person's job. So if anybody is trying to play as an individual, they are naturally doing things wrong unless their job is to play as an individual. An example of that was if you pick Ziggs AD carry bot lane and you pick a roaming support, your Ziggs is alone. Leave him be. He's fine. He's not doing anything. He's just going to clear waves. Go do shit as a 4-man group other places. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, again, similar concept. All of these things start working with each other, and you want to be able to time stuff up with how people want to do their jobs. So top lane wants to make the game a 4v5. If bot lane goes 0-5 before top lane in the winning matchup, has the ability to decimate the opponent and make the game a 4v5, your bot lane screwed up. Doesn't matter their reasoning, doesn't matter their logic. You're just like, oh man, this fight looked good. That doesn't matter. That's not your job. Sometimes, like at the highest level, that can be an acceptable answer. Where it's just like, hey, we should have been able to win this fight. We just misplayed it. It's like, okay, cool. Why'd this get misplayed? Was it a straight up 2v2 that you're not designed to win, but you could have outplayed it? Shouldn't have taken it. Was it a 2v2 and then the opposing jungler came in because you weren't paying attention? Shouldn't have taken it. Let your top lane carry. Let it do its job, right? Because then similar concept. Jungler then wants to path towards where it's strong. Mid lane wants to be able to enable jungle in other lanes. Guess where mid lane's going? Top lane, right?
Right.
Excuse me. AD carry just wants to get gold. Doesn't care about experience, just wants to get gold. They just want to scale. Support doesn't care about anything. Support goes wherever they're needed. Generally going to be mid-top, right? As long as your AD carry is safe. Everybody has their own role to play. And this is where strong and weak sides start coming into the game. Because if jungle always wants to create a strong point, mid lane wants to be able to play around the jungle to be able to create those 2v2s, 3v3s, 4v4s kind of moments, right? They can't be on both sides of the map at the same time. So if both sides of the map have to be strong sides, you're screwed. You are by nature screwed. This is resource management. And then also, again, you want to be able to create these circumstances so that everybody can do their job in these isolated environments. If everybody tries to pull everybody apart, no one can do their job correctly. No one will be able to function whatsoever. It's like in football, if the quarterback gets the ball, I was about to say hike, but oh man, my brain's dying for a second. Quarterback gets the ball, and all of a sudden the running back's like, all right, let me take it out of your hands while you're trying to pass. That's not the plan. That's not the goal. And in similar concept, what happens if the play call was, all right, running back, you take the ball out of the quarterback's hand the second he gets it? Well, that's just a shitty play call. Don't do that.
Right.
The quarterback is trying to pass. And that can't function unless your team is incredibly good. Because if you have an entire team of NFL players versus, like JV high school team, it doesn't matter what you do anymore. Nothing matters. The lineman can pick up the defensive lineman and toss them aside. Doesn't matter if the running back decides to take the ball from the quarterback. Everything's going to work out fine regardless. But that's not what we want to strive for. And especially when you're trying to coach a game and look towards the most realistic circumstances in order to win the game, everything should be trying to attempt to play towards what the ideal world is above all else. And have I explained the ideal compared to actual world to you before?
You haven't explained it, but I feel like it's kind of self-explanatory.
For the most part, just so that we're on the same page. The ideal world is exactly how things would be played. Verbatim, if everybody was computers, this is mathematically a winning line. Take the winning line. The opponent should have no reason to ever take the losing line. Repeat process. And eventually one team will win.
Right.
Actual world is what's on your screen. Those are two vastly separate things. You always want to strive towards the ideal world, right? So again, there will be moments where you have a weak side bot, strong side top, and your bot side just gets 3 solo kills. It's going to happen sometimes. People just int. It occurs. That's not the goal. That's not what people should be playing towards. But if it happens, it happens. Right? And then similar concept. We shouldn't be banking on that to occur. Right? This is also why strong side champions that are very, not volatile, but very susceptible to very easy to play compositions and very like broad things kind of get screwed over. Because what happens if the opponents pick any poke versus Volibear? Well, then you can't play strong side Volibear. He's worthless. What happens if the opponents play counter engage versus Volibear? Well, then you can't play Volibear. He's worthless. What happens if the opponents play tanks versus Volibear? Well, then you can't get the backline. He's worthless. There's so many of those different type of things. And I love using bruisers and juggernauts as this example because every juggernaut runs into the same problem. If the opponent has a Zyra and you have a set's worthless. Garen's worthless. Volibear's worthless. Urgot's half worthless. He works in poke compositions now. That's it. Mordekaiser's worthless. All of these champions become worthless very, very quickly versus very easy to run and very easy to execute and very broad compositions. So they can only come out situationally. And that's, again, where everybody tries to do their own individual job. But what happens if this occurs? Then how does Volibear ever do his job? He can't. And then if he only gets experience, he's not thrilled with it, but he can accept it and try to play as a stun bot and maybe get like a kill on, like he can still kill an AD carry. He can still kill a mid laner situationally if he can get on him. But it's just so goddamn hard to do it. That's hard to justify it. Things like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So then, my brain went scatterbrained for a second. Let me pull this back up into isolated environments. Okay, yeah. So that's kind of how you want to apply those concepts into the isolated environments of how do I want to play out my lane state? Well, what do you want to accomplish? What's your job? Are you strong side? Are you weak side? Do you want to play for experience only? Do you need to play for gold? Do you require some assistance? Where's the mid lane rotating to? Where's the jungler want to play towards? All of those different things. Why? Why are there bots again? No. Find that.
Give us the money. Give us the money.
There's just 2 of them at the same time. Man, if they just typed anything else from that, I might actually listen to them. All right. So, now off of that, we also have to understand burden of execution. Have I ever explained that to you?
I feel like it falls under the same category of like actual versus ideal, which would be like what you would want from it versus what you get out of it.
Kind of. Yeah. It's based on, like, is it realistic for a person to be able to do this thing? So, the example I love to give of this is Singed versus Fiora, right? In a perfect computer world, Fiora wins that. I've watched it happen because of scripters. The reason Fiora wins that is the second Singed tries to flip, there's an animation to flip. She can parry it. Is any human being going to do that without guessing? No. It's not going to happen. So then there's no way for Fiora to be able to realistically W the Singed Fling. If she can't do that, Singed runs away. Fiora now can't do anything because the wave is gone, because Singed flung him. That's the realistic burden of execution, right? And now the realistic burden of execution also changes drastically based on rank. This is where we had the conversation before of like, wanting to play X champions. And it's just like, there's no realistic way that they will get any higher value off of that champion than other champions. If anything, it's more of a volatile thing that can go wrong easier. So, best example I can give of this is Akali. Akali's main combo consists literally of you. Let me draw real quick. Target's here, Akali's here. She ults over top of their head. While she's ulting, she E's them to go back, right? Then she has two options. She can either Shroud, run forward, get the auto attack, Q, back off, get the auto attack, excuse me, and then dash through for an execute, right? Or she just does ult over top of their head with the E, takes the E back, and then auto ults and kills. If Akali misses that E after her ultimate, it's complete dead weight. She won't kill the target anymore. The target walks away. Why would I have a silver player say you have to land your E after your ultimate or you're worthless? Why not just have them play Malphite and they press R when the opponent's near them and then his team kills them? Why would I have to have the silver player space perfectly as Akali during the entire laning phase to be able to land Qs at the max range to be able to hit the slow and also get out of the passive so that they have the auto attack as fast as possible, then trade an auto attack with proper spacing, then also dedicate E correctly to the correct opponent ability, dedicate Shroud correctly to the opponent, understanding her kill threat, being able to escape ganks? There's no reason. Akali will kill the target just like a Malphite or an Ornn or a Cho or a Darius or any of those other champions would. Because also, if we're looking at that, why is either side spacing correctly? Why are either side good mechanically? If they were, they wouldn't be that rank. That's the reality. So then if these champions require so much more effort to be able to do, why don't we just pick something that's easier, burden of execution, that still does the same thing? It works, right? And then when you get really, really high up, you start thinking about, okay, what's a realistic burden of execution for what someone can accomplish? And a lot of the times, this burden of execution goes up over the course of time. So a great example of this would be, for the longest time, I thought Akali lost to Syndra, straight up. And then I watched Showmaker play Akali into Syndra. And what ended up occurring is every single time, so let me draw again. Syndra standing here, Akali standing here. Syndra Qs the Akali. Akali would Shroud and simultaneously throw her E this way to throw herself into the face of Syndra. And dodge the Q, and then just take a full trade onto the Syndra, and the Syndra would lose that trade. And he would just repeat this process. And the Syndra couldn't play the game. I've never seen that before. That completely changed my burden of execution thought process on that matchup. Things like that. So burden of execution also consistently changes, and it has to be kept realistic up until proven otherwise. Because realistically, right, if Akali walks near Syndra, Syndra should Q. Akali should dodge with an ability, and then Syndra should be able to pick up her ball and then throw it down, stun. And also, even though Akali does all this fancy dashing stuff, Syndra can still just ult and kill the Akali. That's still a problem Akali will always have throughout the entire game. But now that I've seen that there is a realistic burden of execution where Akali can win that matchup, it completely changed my perspective on it. Things like that. So with understanding burden of execution, it has to be taken into consideration what the players are, what rank it is, and then also, is it possible to be able to do under basic play? Or like, not basic play, but with some practice. That's the best way to phrase it. So the best example I give of that is Garen. Every low elo player complains about Garen until fucking Kingdom Come. I want you to explain to me real quick how you beat Garen.
You beat him by, well, there's two big things that beat him out.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing, and probably the most important thing, is how you play the lane. Because if you make sure that you are essentially just matching him.
Too broad. Beating him in lane? Yes, that is absolutely correct. How do you beat him in lane? How do you make him not able to play the game?
Wave state.
Wave state. He can just instantaneously clear it. He's pretty tanky. He has a lot of damage output. What do you mean by wave state?
Making sure that you're playing the wave state correctly. Like,
what do you mean by that? Because wave state correctly can mean multiple things. Does that mean you're crashing third wave looking for dive? Does that mean you're freezing? Does that mean you're slow pushing? Does that mean you're letting him push into you consistently because he rushes Tiamat as a champion? And then you're playing around dives? What does it mean?
I'm trying to think of how I'm supposed to try to explain this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not coming up with anything right now.
That's okay. Give me your bad example and maybe I can piece it together.
So what I'm trying to say is that you're playing XYZ champion in Garen.
Right.
Garen has a really strong wave clear.
Right.
So when he clears the wave, it's going to be pushing into you.
Right.
Provided, of course, he's using abilities and he's not, given even a neutral, giving them neutrality, it's still supposed to push into you because of the way he works. So if you let it push into you and you let the wave freeze, then he's going to have to either sit there and wait for the wave to bounce back, which then leaves him wide open for a gank, or you can try and catch it to freeze it. And if that happens, then you can keep the wave closer to your turret so you're safer, and he's still exposed to a gank for a longer period of time.
Okay, so let's touch on that a little bit. So, first off, that's not exactly correct. Because the description you gave was the majority of ways you can be able to deal with a person if you are stronger than them, should I say. Right? So the majority of top laners, if they hold a freeze versus Garen, they're probably just dead. That's just kind of how he functions, where he has that high of damage output. So he is susceptible to ganks. That is 100% true. Yes. Problem is your jungler can't be top forever. And then also, again, remember that high wave clear thing? So if he has high damage and high wave clear, it'll take him under 5 seconds to be able to crash a wave if you're holding it, because he will just force you off. And then once he forces you off, if you another wave came in, he can just clear it. All right. So he is susceptible to ganks. That works. Holding a freeze versus him can function if your jungler is immediately top. Problem with the other part of the thought process is, why is he just pushing the wave? What burden does he have to just mindlessly push the wave? He doesn't have to press E. There's no requirement. This is why partway through my explanation of what do you mean by wave state, I said, if someone builds a Tiamat and has to push. That was the specification. If Garen never has to push, what happens if he just freezes on you? It can go both ways very easily.
Right.
So let's think about that for a second. Realistically, right? Garen has a very major flaw in him. In his entire kit. What is it?
What is his major flaw?
He has to run directly at you with no dashes whatsoever. He has the Volibear problem. He is very, very straightforward in exactly what he wants to do, with no variation to it whatsoever. The only thing he could do is he can Q flash on you. That's it. That's all he's got. So the major problem that lower elo players have with him is spacing. They get too close to him too frequently, and then he just pounces on them. Because now let's think about that, right? If you're playing, let's What's a good example? Let's go with Aatrox, right? No, actually, Aatrox is too long range. Let's go a little shorter than that. Let us play... Cloud's not a good example, too tanky. Let's go with Mordekaiser. Mord has to get in there, right? So if Mord has to get in there, right, you have a couple options. You can wait for Garen to use an ability, and then you can walk forward because now he doesn't have kill threat. Again, very, very simplistic champion. He only has the one pattern. He's going to Q you, he's going to spin on you. If he doesn't have spin, he doesn't have damage. If he doesn't have Q, can't get on you. Awesome. Works out really nicely that way, right? If that's the case, you can play around this, like what he can do very, very easily and actively choose never to die to him. Because Garen is also pretty much just a single target nuke. Yes, the spin is AoE, but for the most part, he's going to Q a single target, he's going to ult a single target. He's looking at one person to say you die. That is his purpose in life. The E is just wave clear. So if that's the case, when the wave is pushing away from you, you can wait for assistance for your jungler to come. And Garen will be useless in a 2v1. Completely useless. In a 2v2 scenario, he is still half useless. He's just really, really bad in that scenario as well. He literally states, if I get on top of a single target and they are completely alone, they are fucked. But you can space around that. You can play around that with your jungler. You can play around that with your mid laner. You can determine to say, I will not die to this Garen. And what happens if a Garen is 0-0-0, up 100 farm, and joins a team fight?
He should do.
Oh, go ahead.
He should just get CC'd.
Yeah. He'll just get kited out just like he was in laning phase and lose. There's nothing he can do. Garen only functions whenever an entire team has to come into him. Same concept with all the other juggernauts. That's what they want. If you don't give them that, they're useless. So people in low elo have a massive issue with Garen because they walk right at him and they don't space around him whatsoever. So now similar concept, right? If people aren't going to space around a Garen who has to mindlessly run at you with a slight movement speed increase that lasts for a second and a half unless you're maxing it, what are the odds they're going to space around a Malphite ult at any point in time whatsoever during the game? Or an Ornn ultimate? Or an Alawi tentacle? Or a Gragas body slam? Or a Leona engage? So if all of that's the case, why do we need to play Camille? Where we need to do all this fancy stuff to be able to do stuff. Why do we need to play Shaco in the jungle when people already aren't paying attention to stuff? Doesn't need to happen.
Right. You can just play the thing that's easier to play because it's safer and reduces the burden of execution.
Exactly.
Vocabulary.
So now we get into the final section, which is explaining information to others. So far during all of this, there's been kind of two things. Because I love asking questions during this because I love to hear people's response and their thought process. Because even if it's wrong, I like to see where they're thinking about it, right? So it seems like overall explaining information to others, for you in particular, you weren't able to explain your thought process to me very well. Where no matter what question I asked, it was either very broad, and broad as in like the majority of the information is not relevant. So if I ask, like even the starting question, what is Volibear's main purpose in life? And you went off saying like, okay, he has a jump, he can disable turrets, he has a shield. None of that's his main purpose in life. All that is information about him, but it's not what's required to be able to learn. Right?
Right.
So in order to be able to explain the information to others, it has to be condensed in a way that people understand. So I'm going to use Jack as an example. I don't know if he's still in chat. Jack hates math. That talk we had about Spirit Visage and Force of Nature, I tried having that talk with him after a game of just like, okay, both are relevant. Here's why. You were playing Tom Kench for it. At the end of my rant that lasted about like 7 minutes, he responded with, I don't like math. I kind of zone out during it. Can you give me the short version? So, with that, in order to be able to actually, again, explain information to others, it's based on their personality and what they require. But regardless, it all has to be relevant to what is currently being talked about, right? So even when we're thinking about, like, why bruisers are bruisers, why burstcasters are burstcasters, why tanks are tanks, right? Understanding the why then allows you to be able to explain it correctly, but the why has to be understood. And that's the most important thing to be able to take away from today for explaining things to others, right? Because all this information, like from game theory to how the champs fit, to the thematics, to applying numbers to thematics, right? All of that, you can now apply this to literally any game whatsoever in any circumstance, and you will come up with a pretty decent explanation for it, right? At a base level, right? And that's what's required to be able to then continue to advance. Because now that you understand this, when a new change occurs, now you understand that change better. And the information keeps adding on top of each other over and over and over and over and over. And the why is by far the most important part. Because again, why is something played top lane? Well, it can't be gold reliant unless it's a hard counterpick. It has to be, excuse me, something that cares majority about XP, and it has to be able to utilize TP correctly. Right? If it's not one of those things, it has to be a very specific circumstance. So like Ornn into Vayne. Vayne will always be able to get that gold. Gangplank top lane. He doesn't TP. He ults. It's an equivalent exchange.
Right.
Right? That kind of stuff. Right? And now once you get that why, again, you get to start expanding things very heavily. Because there are moments where, for instance, Caston top does work. There are moments when, let me look through real quick, J4 top works. It was played in Worlds versus Kennen, where it's literally like, okay, my TPs are great, my scaling is fantastic. Let me rephrase that. My scaling into mid-game is fantastic. I have the broken item, I'm fitting the thematic of the team, and I'm dealing with a Kennen, so I want to poke him out. Do you remember the rune that they were taking with top J4?
I do not remember.
It was Airy. Do you remember what ability they maxed?
E?
E. All they did was spam E to Kingdom fucking Come. Their thematic was, I'm going to join mid-game fights and be a tank. I have to poke out in laning phase. Take the rune for poke, max the ability for poke, start D-ring. It fit the thematic. Were there better options in order to do this thematic? Maybe. That's where the math part comes in. But at a base value, everything they did fit the thematic. And that's what mattered above all else. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions on any of this stuff whatsoever, overarching, or any additional questions on anything?
I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over this stuff in regards to what I've taken note-wise. And I will get back to you when I have accumulated what I may be confused on. Because I feel like there's a lot of extremely good information here that covers basically a very, almost like an algorithm to being able to answer questions that revolve around just about any game. And I think that being given these tools is going to help me significantly to be able to answer questions for people in a much more thoughtful and organized way. I think my biggest difficulty is kind of formulating that in particular right now, and just being able to take my time to do that is kind of what is difficult for me to do. Is I can find the answer, it's just that I overthink it really hard. So if the answer isn't something that, you know, is right in front of you, I'm typically looking above the shelf instead of on it.
Right.
Which is a big issue of mine, which I think is something that kind of became apparent during our 3 hours together. And I think that's something that I'll be more attentive about as well, is maybe the answer to my question isn't nearly as complicated as I keep making myself out to think it is.
All right, I want to end on two things. One, again, keep in mind, even in scrims when I get asked a question, I take a second to think about it. I don't just magically know an answer unless I'm already paying attention to what's required. But most of the time where it's just like Moose asking me, hey, what item do I build? I literally ask him to hold tab for like 5 seconds so I can look at both teams, look at their itemization, look at what's required. Even though I drafted, I know both teams. I still need to relook at it and double check.
Right.
Even I still do that. And the second thing to be able to end on is there are 2 ways to be able to coach. One is coaching a pattern. A pattern causes a person to be able to do the same thing over and over, and that is used for climbing. That is used for lower elo players generally, where it's like, okay, if you repeat this pattern, unless someone knows how to deal with this pattern, you're going to win. And even if they know how to deal with that pattern, if you're the better mechanical player, you're probably still going to win. Get really good at the pattern, get really good at these champions, you're good to go. That's why people say play 2 to 3 champions in ranked only. You're getting used to a pattern. The second way to coach, which is the infinitely better way, as long as someone already has an understanding about what's going to be happening, like they want to improve being a better player, not just improve the rank, or like have a quick fix, is understand or teaching concepts. This is what all of this was. Teaching concepts allows people to come to their own conclusions and be able to start thinking for themselves, because the game is incredibly fluid and has way too many scenarios for me to sit down and say, all right, in this scenario, you do this exact thing with this, because that's the perfect world thing. There is no exact perfect world. People are going to make mistakes. Understanding what the perfect world is allows you to see mistakes and then allows you to be able to understand how to punish them. But all of that is taken from an understanding of the overarching concepts to be able to apply them to individual concepts that will happen so frequently that you're going to have to keep doing it on repeat over and over and over and over and over, because every scenario is different.
Right.
Very rarely will you have two of the same. So if you do want to, again, like, so for right now you're coaching JV. So with JV right now, with their elos, a pattern will generally be better. But they still need to understand the overarching concepts and similar concepts if you want to coach another team in the future. The lower the elo, the more you want pattern, but they still have to understand the overarching, or else they will get stuck in that pattern.
Right.
And if they get stuck in that pattern, they are screwed.
Right.
It'll take a lot to break them out of that. All right. Any final remarks, questions? Anything left? That's all I got for today.
Gotcha. This was really good information. I appreciate the time, and I hope that this is going to be, helpful as a tool for you to be able to teach other people. I think the way that you presented it was really good too. Asking questions, keeping me engaged that way is really helpful, particularly because I have a pretty hard time like sitting down, especially in a kind of lecture situation.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's one-on-one time like this, I think that difference is pretty significant, because then I have that force of situation where it's like, hey, you answer this question. It's like, fuck, okay, so I do have to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is something that I do want to learn, so it's very helpful to be able to put myself in this spot and get some advice from someone who I think is pretty damn good at what he does.
Thank you. That's also the thing I was talking about at the start, where it's just like, I hate verbatim telling people like, no, this is wrong, because that's not how it should ever be.
Because that's not how things work. There are absolutes to certain things in regards to the aspect of a game. Like, if you pull the trigger, you're gonna fucking shoot. That's not an argument. But the difference is, like, why is this champion good in the top lane? Like, being able to explain that is gonna be very important.
Yeah, again, similar concept. Me just saying like, oh yeah, this works here. It's just like, it doesn't serve a purpose. That's not how learning works. Learning has to be interactive.
Right. And I definitely appreciate that you're putting the time forth to talk to me. And I know that you had set up your spreadsheet to be able to set up times with other people too. So, from me and the rest of the community, I highly appreciate what you're doing and putting that time in to kind of educate the community and give them an opportunity to utilize tools is really good.
Thank you. All right. Would you also like me to send this to you?
Absolutely. I do have it written in front of me, but having it in text on my computer might be useful as well, just because I might be able to kind of use it as a checklist kind of ordeal when I'm looking at other information. But this is very helpful, and I highly appreciate it. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So off of that, I'm going to hop out of call.
All
Have a good
right,
night, man.
buddy.
I might see you later
Thanks.
tonight. I might be playing some.
You too. Deuces.
All right. For those in stream, thank you for sticking around. Also, Fox, no, it's not that I don't want to talk to you. It's that whenever I'm in a one-on-one, I like focusing on that as much as possible, because I want to give as much information to that person as possible if they're giving me their time as well. Also, hold on. You were a good mod. There you go. Enjoy. All right. So also, for anyone still watching, if you have any feedback on this as well, now granted, this was supposed to be more of a podcast type thing because wherever I'm coaching how to coach, it's very hard to pull up individual replays due to the fact of if I do, it's that specific circumstance comparatively to the overarching thing. And then also, I have to find the overarching concept in a VOD, which is not a very easy thing to do. Especially when you're looking for, again, overarching stuff comparatively to like, hey, mid lane. I can find a mid lane VOD really easily, and I can just go over that stuff. But overarching stuff becomes very, very difficult. I'd have to have, like, things really, really pre-prepped by a long shot. Like extended videos and whatnot. And I don't know how to edit. So that's a later thing. So, if you have any comments about it, whether it was good, whether it was bad, anything you guys liked or whatnot, send them my way. I would appreciate it. And off of that, I will be ending the stream for the day. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I will be working with Twins. He's a Master 80 carry. And we'll go from there. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.